Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 1161, Transformation. The power of a Supreme Lord was simply magnificent. If the several Supreme Lords present there released all of their powers at once, then they would probably be able to instantly shatter this giant yellow sand star. They were restraining their strengths even when they were fighting for Zen's fairy palace. In reality, they were not looking at this battle as a matter of life and death at all. But even so, the power that erupted from these Supreme Lords was far superior to that of an ordinary warrior. They were just beyond imaginable. As Addison roared in both anger and shock, the other several Supreme Lords all joined in the battle at the same time. The first target of these Supreme Lords was to get the mini fairy palace located on the desert. Elena slightly furrowed her brows upon realizing that. Her eyes flashed with hostility when she immediately raised the Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer in her hand. As the hammer gently shook, it released a streak of lightning of 100,000 feet long. Countless beams of lightning circled her, forming a massive vortex around where she stood. The thunder law contained within this thunder had already reached the 8th layer or even the 9th layer. Even a Supreme Lord would have no choice but to back away if faced with a sharp vortex of thunder. Thus, the faces of the Supreme Lords were suddenly flooded with both surprise and anger. The Demon Knight's Queen of Punishment really took action to attack without the slightest hesitation. All the other Supreme Lords were startled except for Elena, who remained calm and determined. How could she allow others to snatch away the things she wanted to get? After the lightning dissipated, she looked down and was slightly stunned, finding out that the mini fairy palace was already gone. It's too childish to expect to run away. In Elena's eyes, relying on a space treasure to escape before so many Supreme Lords was simply daydreaming. She then gently raised her hand and instantly, a huge crack appeared at the edge of the desert on the yellow sand star. It didn't even take a second when the crack continued to extend and circle the entire desert. Beneath the desert was soil and beneath the soil was a layer of rock stratum. Rumble. The desert, the soil below the yellow sand star, the rock stratum and even the mantle underneath the star's surface were completely lifted by Elena. If one were to look from above the starlight, it seemed that a giant was holding a ladle, scooping up a large part of the yellow sand star. She was that strong. There was a huge pit that was thousands of miles deep at the bottom of the desert. After digging up the ground, Elena once again waved the Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer in her hand. With a light wave, the hammer burst with lightning and smashed into the desert. Boom! Right after the hammer drilled the desert, the entire desert started to collapse and disappear under such a strong attack. Whoosh! A tiny fairy palace shot out from the debris as the ground broke and threw out dust from it. With a sneer, Elena began to chase after the fairy palace again. The other Supreme Lords all began to move at the same time. Elena might be slightly stronger than them, but it was still extremely difficult for a Supreme Lord to kill another Supreme Lord. More so, those who were skilled with spatial transference. The several Supreme Lords passed through space and headed toward the mini fairy palace too. Elena wielded the Saint Thunder Meteor Hammer once again to disturb her opponents. The power of this strike was more than twice as great as the previous strike under the infusion of a dense amount of faith energy. Humph! Do you really think we're afraid of you? A crimson fire ring suddenly appeared in the hand of one of the Supreme Lords. His body was erupting with fire. Heavenly annihilating flame. An extremely terrifying heat shot all over the place when he released his fire ring. Cracks appeared in the space around the fire ring and the space started to collapse continuously. Even the space could not withstand the power of fire. Then, the red fire ring continuously circled in the air and went straight for Elena. Another Supreme Lord also took action and attacked Elena right at that moment. As his hands flicked out, his entire figure seemed to be floating in the water. He stretched out his hands and pointed at Elena, freezing her before softly whispering, "Break." Crack. A strange crack suddenly appeared right where Elena was standing. Shockingly, the crack spread through Elena's body. Elena's entire body was enveloped in a thick aura of faith energy by that time. The faith energy was the solid foundation of strength for her to battle against the Supreme Lords. Nonetheless, the crack that appeared in the space was a very strange method of attack. It was extremely overbearing and had directly split the faith energy apart. A moment after and a gash appeared on Alina's bare right shoulder, making her blood burst out from the fresh opening. If the crack continued to extend, it would directly split Alina's body into two. It was at that moment when the Saint Sky armor on Alina's body suddenly flickered with a rich light. Many streaks of strange and obscure light appeared on the surface of the Saint Sky armor, forcefully stopping the crack from extending any further. This was, after all, a Saint Sky armor. In the entire universe, this Saint Sky armor was a defensive supreme divine weapon and was incomparable. Although Elena succeeded in avoiding the first attack by using the Saint Sky armor, the blood-red fire ring of the other Supreme Lord swept towards her. Other than these two Supreme Lords, the other two Supreme Lords were also eyeing her like tigers eyeing their prey. It was really hard for Elena to resist the siege of 4 Supreme Lords at once. However, retreating was not necessary in her mind right now. Since these 4 Supreme Lords attacked and delayed her, Elena failed to obtain Zen's mini-fairy palace again. The palace drilled into another desert on the yellow sand star while all the clamor was happening. It was clear to the Supreme Lords that the mini-fairy palace wouldn't escape them regardless of what it could do. Therefore, the most important thing for them now was to deal with Elena, who had every intention of taking the mini-palace away. Those Supreme Lords had different ideas and plans in their minds. Some wanted to sit down and discuss while others wanted to get a chance to take the fairy palace directly. However, none of them expected Elena to appear and go straight to the fairy palace in an exceptionally domineering manner. Thus, she became the center of their attention, making some of the Supreme Lords want to besiege her. Now that they had joined hands to force Elena to back away, one of the Supreme Lords tried to catch up to the mini-fairy palace. He intended to grab the tiny space treasure first regardless of anything. Within the fairy palace, Zen, Lavender, and Sol were closely watching the battle outside. Sol was the one who was controlling the fairy palace at that time. He commanded it to drill into the desert again. With a huge grin on his face, he said, "I'll transform the fairy palace once more." Although the fairy palace was transformed from a token with the word mountain embedded on it, it could also freely morph into various shapes. After entering the interior of the yellow sand star, it directly transformed into a palm-sized stone. Just as the fairy palace had completed its transformation, a Supreme Lord waved his hand and once again the massive desert was dug out from the yellow sand star. The Supreme Lord used the same method as Elena's and then burnt the desert with the blazing flames. Being burnt by the flames, the desert sand turned into numerous transparent crystals which began to melt. Not long after, a desert of 100 miles long had been burnt down and only a little part of it was left. A few scattered items fell to the large hole at the bottom of the yellow sand star. As a stone among the items, the fairy palace kept tumbling in the air before falling into the hole and stopped moving. The Supreme Lord got no clue that what he was searching for just flew out somewhere. A wondering expression appeared on his face. He stood bewildered, looking at his empty hand. He almost grabbed it. How could the fairy palace disappear? He had burned the entire desert, yet he couldn't find that fairy palace again. There was no space fluctuation happening right now. That space treasure must be on top of the yellow sand star. Another Supreme Lord said indifferently. Humph, I reckon that the fairy palace must be here. Another Supreme Lord began to count on his fingers and try to figure out the palace's location. As long as the crown of destiny wasn't carried by anyone, it wasn't difficult to figure out its position. Moreover, the Supreme Lord was not far away from the crown of destiny, so it would not be so complicated to deduce its location. The Supreme Lord, who was calculating the space, suddenly turned towards the yellow sand star. Then with a frown, he muttered, "It is indeed still on the yellow sand star, but what happened just now?" Chapter 1162, Burn the Star. A look of confusion appeared on the faces of all the Supreme Lords. Even Elena, Supreme Lord Addison, and Supreme Lord Gunter stopped fighting. Nothing could escape from these mighty warriors, and that was precisely why they had started fighting. They had been confident that the mini-fairy palace wouldn't be able to go anywhere. But now, it had inexplicably disappeared. Escaping under the watchful eyes of so many Supreme Lords was impossible. The Supreme Lords quickly began to analyze the situation, and they all soon came to the same conclusion: the fairy palace hadn't left the yellow sand star and was merely hiding within it. Faced with this tricky situation, the Supreme Lords that gathered on the yellow sand star naturally stopped quarreling. They had all come for the crown of destiny, and that was their only goal. They had no interest in sparring with other Supreme Lords. Elena's cold gaze swept across the surface of the yellow sand star over and over again, but she did not find any clues. In the end, her hostile eyes fell upon the other Supreme Lords. She cursed inwardly, if it weren't for these mongrels, the fairy palace wouldn't be able to hide from me. Whoosh! A few more figures descended from the sky. Several other Supreme Lords had rushed over. Supreme Lord Miles! Someone exclaimed. Supreme Lord Miles was a mid-rank Supreme Lord. Even Elena frowned at the sight of him. Supreme Lord Immortal. When Supreme Lord Immortal descended, his gaze first landed on Supreme Lord Miles. The two of them were a famous pair of rivals, bringing joy and entertainment to all creatures in the universe. They had been challenging and quarreling with each other for countless years, but they hadn't fought against each other even once. Many Supreme Lords had asked them why they hadn't engaged in a real fight, but the two of them always ignored those questions. Now that the Supreme Lords gathered on the yellow sand star saw these two appear together, they thought that the two would immediately start bickering again. They never imagined that these two Supreme Lords would greet each other so warmly. It was as if they were good friends who hadn't seen each other in a long time. When two Supreme Lords fought against each other, the crown of destiny would dissipate after one of them died, and then it would randomly appear in a corner of the universe. So after a Supreme Lord killed another, the greatest benefit would fall into the hands of others. As a result, Supreme Lords would not fight to the death against each other unless they were sworn enemies. Previously, when Elena had fought with 4 Supreme Lords, none of them had used all their might. Not long after, more Supreme Lords arrived. The number of Supreme Lords circling Yellow Sand Star had reached 20. It was extremely rare for so many Supreme Lords to be gathered in the same place. Even back in the days when the Heavenly Fruit Assembly was held, there were only 18 Supreme Lords. But now, on the Yellow Sand Star, there were 20. And these Supreme Lords had all been attracted here by Zen, a mere Soul Sea Realm warrior. What? That magic space treasure that looks like a fairy palace is hiding within the Yellow Sand Star right under your very eyes? Supreme Lord Miles asked in disbelief as he shook his head. Then, he added, let me deal with it. He slightly raised his head and clasped his hands together. 2 golden beams of light shot out from his eyes. The golden beams of light spread out and swept across the surface of Yellow Sand Star. It is said that Supreme Lord Miles' rebirth pupils are able to see through the myriad of illusions under the heavens. I presume that he will be able to find that fairy palace, a Supreme Lord said with a faint smile. Supreme Lord Miles' expression was indifferent. If it was true that the fairy palace was using a mere illusion technique, then his rebirth pupils would naturally be able to unravel the illusion. The Yellow Sand Star was not particularly large. In just a few seconds, the 2 rays of golden light had completely scanned the star. Following that, a puzzled expression appeared on Supreme Lord Miles' face. This is really strange. I can't see the fairy palace even though it is clearly on the Yellow Sand Star. This is impossible. His rebirth pupils were the eye technique he had cultivated from the heavenly destiny that he carried. It contained the law of causality to see through everything, and this law of causality wasn't something he had cultivated himself, but something he had inherited from the heavenly destiny. There was nothing within the heavens that he couldn't see through. If the fairy palace was hiding in plain sight using an illusion technique, how could he not see through it? This was a violation of the rules of the heavens. Unless the fairy palace was something that surpassed the heavens. Even the rebirth pupils couldn't see it. A Supreme Lord pondered aloud. As Supreme Lords, they were all well aware of the heavenly destiny they carried. Each heavenly destiny had inherited an extremely powerful law of causality, and these laws of causality were the supreme laws of this universe. From the smallest grain of sand in this universe to the stars in the sky and the 100,000 supreme worlds, everything had to follow these laws of causality without an exception. Hot water would boil when heated. Warriors would encounter heavenly tribulations when they were too strong. These were all laws of causality. These could also be considered the laws of the universe. The laws set down by the heavens could not be violated. Elena's expression became increasingly sullen. In order to humiliate Lavender, she had acted on her own volition and sent out Vivica, Elspeth, Salvador, and Anisha to deal with her. However, she had wasted a considerable amount of time by doing that. Now, the number of Supreme Lords that gathered in front of her was rapidly increasing. Meanwhile, the tiny fairy palace was gone. It would be great if she could find it before anyone else. Her biggest goal was to kill Lavender, but the crown of destiny was still an object that she had to obtain. With so many Supreme Lords in front of her, it would not be an easy task for her and Supreme Lord Gunter to forcibly take the crown of destiny away. Let me do it. Who cares what illusion technique he is using? This move is the simplest and most effective one, said Supreme Lord Immortal. The flame in his hand turned into the shape of a fire dragon and continuously floated around in his hand. Since I can't see where the fairy palace is, I'll burn the entire star to ashes. After he finished speaking, that wisp of flame pounced forward. The tiny fire dragon flew out from his palm and quickly grew in size, transforming into a huge fire dragon that soared into the sky and headed straight for the yellow sand star. Whoosh! As the fire dragon continued to grow in size, it circled around the star, wrapping it up in flames. All of the Supreme Lords retreated temporarily. None of them could deny that Supreme Lord Immortal's method was an effective one. Destroying a star was not a difficult task for a Supreme Lord. If several Supreme Lords attacked together, even a Supreme World would be torn to pieces, let alone a star like the Yellow Sand Star. The Orange Sea World of the Human Alliance was an example. Although the Yellow Sand Star was considered a relatively small star, its diameter was over 80,000 miles. It was an absolute colossus. However, after the fire dragon wrapped it up, the surface of the Yellow Sand Star turned black, and then it began to slowly melt. He wants to burn the entire star down, Zen murmured. His eyebrows twitched. Supreme Lord Immortal is such a decisive man. When Supreme Lord Immortal began to burn the Yellow Sand Star, Zen sensed a faint trace of sorrow in his perception. When that feeling of sorrow was transmitted to him, he instantly understood that it came from the will of the stars. Stars had their own will. Zen had understood that long ago when he had practiced the stellar body. So far, he had already activated more than 20 stars. The sadness of the stars that he felt was emitted from the stars that he himself had activated. It was a pity that he couldn't do anything to prevent this. Zen shook his head slightly. He could only watch as Supreme Lord Immortal continued burning down the Yellow Sand Star. Boom! Under the embrace of the fire dragon, a huge crack appeared in the middle of the Yellow Sand Star. It was actually starting to fall apart. However, the flames of Supreme Lord Immortal did not die down. Instead, they continued burning the Yellow Sand Star with fierce intensity. Under the constant burning, the Yellow Sand Star's size continued to shrink. The easily incinerated materials within the star were burned away. Within 5 minutes, the diameter of the Yellow Sand Star shrank from 80,000 miles to 40,000 miles. An hour later, the Yellow Sand Star shrank down to just 10,000 miles in diameter. Just like that, a huge star had been slowly burned down. However, the fairy palace was still quietly lying inside. Humph, let's see how long the fairy palace can hold against such heat. Let's see how long it can hide. Brat, you scolded me back then. I can reject that crown of destiny, but I will definitely take your roaring token. Supreme Lord Immortal was someone who held grudges. He still remembered the time when Zen had insulted him when he was feeling down. Chapter 1163, A Grain of Sand. Even if Supreme Lord Immortal released his hottest flames, the rate at which the Yellow Sand Star burned had slowed down. This star's surface was only soft sand and underneath was 10 miles of soil. Beneath the soil was a layer of hard rock, under which lay the mantle. The mantle was made of tougher stuff than normal rock and encased the very core of the star. A star's core was extremely sturdy and its weight was equally astonishing. A palm-sized core was equal to the weight of an entire mountain. It was impossible for Supreme Lord Immortal's flames to burn the entire star out in just a short period of time. Leave the crown of destiny to me. There is someone in my clan who urgently needs it. Supreme Lord Miles said, taking advantage of the situation. Someone in your clan needs it. Are you joking? You're not the only one who needs the crown of destiny. A Supreme Lord protested. It was a fact that there were many world lords in this boundless universe but too few crowns of destiny. Nearly 20 Supreme Lords had arrived, and Zen's use of the roaring token was only going to invite more. A huge problem had now posed itself. Who took ownership of the crown of destiny? It was not something that could be halved, nor could it be shredded into pieces for distribution. Humph, you greedy guys. All you think about is this crown of destiny, but none of you has ever considered the most important thing. This is the 129th crown of destiny. If there really is someone who carries the heavenly destiny, then has any of you thought about what would happen? Another Supreme Lord asked in a clear voice. His words plunged everyone into silence. A single round of heavens could only carry 128 heavenly destinies. This number had always been constant. What would happen with the emergence of the 129th? Nobody knew. Would it perhaps trigger the collapse of heavens? Would it end this grand era so suddenly? The risks were numerous and too heavy to even start comprehending. The silence was heavy among these mighty Supreme Lords, and it was only broken by the appearance of another one of their ranks. Renell, you've finally come, Supreme Lord Addison greeted. Supreme Lord Addison had been the first one to arrive, but the arrival of so many others had pushed him to the very edge of the crowd. He was one of the oldest Supreme Lords, yet prestige was not determined by age but by the heavenly destiny. The power of the law of causality contained within a heavenly destiny was directly proportional to the strength of a Supreme Lord. Supreme Lord Addison's heavenly destiny was not particularly amazing and was considered as one of the weakest out of all Supreme Lords. However, the expressions of all other Supreme Lords present changed the moment they heard the name, Venerable. This newcomer was not only the second-ranked Supreme Lord among all ogres, but he was also a mid-ranked Supreme Lord with incomparable fierceness. It could be said that his strength was on par with both Supreme Lord Miles and Supreme Lord Immortal, maybe even stronger. He was the third mid-ranked Supreme Lord to have made his appearance before the Yellow Sand Star. In his arrival, he brought with him thousands of densely packed, skeleton-like shadows that constantly gnawed at his back. It was fortunate that these skeleton-like shadows were no match to his protective life vitality. "Venerable, why are there so many skeletons behind your back?" Supreme Lord Addison asked as he gave the skeletons a strange look. "I encountered the shadow race when I rushed over here," Supreme Lord Venerable replied with a somewhat angry expression. "They were extremely persistent and dared to actually chase after me. I killed quite a few of them." "The shadow race actually dared to chase after you?" Supreme Lord Addison asked in bewilderment. The reactions of the other Supreme Lords were of similar puzzlement. The shadow race was extremely troublesome and no Supreme Lord had any desire to provoke any of them. It was not because they feared them, but because the members of this race released these persistent skeletons upon their death. It wasn't easy to get rid of these skeletons. They would latch onto their target and constantly bite him or her. It was essentially the curse of a dying shadow race member, one that would last for several years. A skeleton's bite was nothing to a Supreme Lord, but it was extremely annoying. Still, Supreme Lord Venerable's predicament was only a momentary distraction. The main issue here was the Yellow Sand Star that was currently burning in front of them. Meanwhile, inside the fairy palace, Zen was currently passing by the time. "The Yellow Sand Star is getting smaller and smaller," he mumbled, revealing a trace of worry on his face. If this went on, he would have nowhere to hide anymore. Saul's face maintained a deadpan expression, not really particularly worried about their current situation. Transforming the fairy palace into a stone was still too eye-catching. "I shall turn it into a grain of sand instead," he declared, and instantly transformed the stone into a minuscule grain of sand that immediately fused into the star core. Outside, the Supreme Lords continued arguing amongst themselves. Despite being warriors of might, they were no different from ordinary mortals when it came to furthering their own agendas. Everyone was on high alert as the matter of ownership of the crown of destiny hung tensely over their heads. If it ever came to it, a fight to the death was highly possible. But for now, they could only wait for the entire star to burn out before making their move. A bead of sweat ran down Supreme Lord Immortal's temple as he looked at the burning star. With a wave of his hand, a fire dragon once again appeared in his hand. He immediately threw it onto the burning star and watched as it assimilated with the fire dragon from before, increasing its firepower by twofold. "Supreme Lord Immortal, I'm here to lend you a hand," another Supreme Lord offered. Almost every Supreme Lord had completely comprehended the original laws of the universe, and even those who did not necessarily practice fire attribute cultivation methods were still far superior to ordinary warriors in terms of the fire law. Bang! There was a loud explosion as more power was poured into the fire dragon, greatly strengthening its flames. The joint forces of the Supreme Lords helped burn the star much faster. The rate at which it shrank was even visible to them. 1,000 miles in diameter. 800 miles in diameter. 100 miles in diameter. The initial layers had been burned away, leaving behind a solid glazed substance that was similar to hot, molten metal. 10 miles in diameter. 1 mile. 1,000 feet. Finally, the star core made its appearance. The 80,000-mile diameter yellow sand star was no more. All that remained now was this small core, which was the size of a person's fist. The sight of this black object made the Supreme Lords' faces fall. Where is the mini fairy palace? He couldn't have possibly escaped, right? Did he run away through spatial transference? That's not possible. We would have seen it if he did. Questions ran through each of the Supreme Lords' minds, but none of them could comprehend just how the small fairy palace suddenly disappeared right under their very noses. Perhaps it was in this fist-sized, black star core. Supreme Lord Immortal extended a hand and made a few calculations with his fingers. "Continue to burn the star core," he declared with a cold sneer. "The fairy palace is truly very interesting. It is actually hiding inside the very core itself." And he was right. The mini fairy palace had turned into a grain of sand that had drilled itself into the very center of this impossibly hard star core. And as long as Supreme Lord Immortal continued with his incineration, then the mini fairy palace would eventually be exposed. There was another huge burst of flames as the star core was once again set alight by the Supreme Lords. From the size of a fist, it shrank down to the size of a pebble, until it finally vanished and left behind a grain of sand that slowly rotated in the air. Chapter 1164, showing their special skills. Such was a rare phenomenon, that it could almost be considered a miracle. A star over 80,000 miles in diameter was forcefully refined just like that. No one else but a Supreme Lord could accomplish such a feat. They were so powerful that even a grain of sand couldn't escape a Supreme Lord's heightened senses. When they discovered this particular grain of sand, however, they couldn't help but be surprised. When the Supreme Lords saw the little fairy palace back then, they didn't think much about it. It didn't matter to them as it was just a space treasure. Now that they had a closer look at this grain of sand, they realized that it wasn't just an ordinary treasure. Because that grain of sand had undergone tempering of Supreme Lord Immortal's fire. However, the Supreme Lords couldn't see the mysteries inside the grain of sand. Then again, it was the only thing left unrefined from everything that Supreme Lord Immortal's fire had burned. Thus, it could be said that the grain of sand was the embodiment of the little fairy palace. It floated about in the air for a while, and then it shot towards the north. One Supreme Lord wore a cold smirk, before he stretched out one hand and tore apart a vast space. The grain of sand was sucked into the shattered space. Then the surrounding spaces folded together and used their power to easily bind the grain of sand inside it. Such a powerful space treasure is truly unheard of, a Supreme Lord said with a shake of his head. There were only a select few treasures that could cause a Supreme Lord to have such thoughts. It was difficult to tempt them, they wouldn't budge even if a supreme divine weapon appeared in front of their faces. However, this fairy palace had so many changes that even the Supreme Lords present couldn't see through it. It had even withstood Supreme Lord Immortal's fire. Therefore, the Supreme Lords naturally wanted such a space treasure. Before, they only wanted the crown of destiny and the roaring token, and destroy this space treasure. Now, they sang a different song. This space treasure was definitely a rare treasure. Your name is Zen, right? One Supreme Lord, who remembered Zen's name, said. You can come out. Although we Saya people are not a big race, we can ensure your survival if you offer this space treasure and the crown of destiny with both hands. Survival. Ha ha, kid, although you are only at the Soul Sea realm, I can make an exception and accept you as my disciple. The price would be your crown of destiny and this ever-changing fairy palace, Supreme Lord Renell of the Ogres casually said. On the other hand, Alina's blood ran cold upon hearing the two Supreme Lords. These old freaks were only there to steal the crown of destiny and the other treasures, but Alina's real goal was to kill Lavender. It would be quite troublesome for her if Zen accepted any deal with this group of Supreme Lords. It was true that the Demon Knight was powerful. However, only Supreme Lord Gunter, out of all the Supreme Lords, supported Elena. There really wasn't much that she could do against these old monsters. Although she was infuriated, she remained silent. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate to this point. Dang it, so many Supreme Lords came because of Zen, she thought. After a while, Zen's voice once again rang throughout the universe. Haha, I am truly honored. Thank you all for your kind intentions, but I have another use for this crown of destiny. If you want me to offer it to you with both hands, you are dreaming. Zen's words made the light in the Supreme Lord's eyes turn frigid. How could the crown of destiny be of use to a mere Soul Sea realm martial artist like him? Moreover, how did the boy think he would survive with so many Supreme Lords around him? Supreme Lord Addison couldn't help but say, there's no point talking to this boy. Let me break apart this space treasure. Once he finished his words, the black smoke behind him exploded and he rushed to grab the grain of sand. It's only shattering the space treasure. I can do it too. I don't need you to help me out, said the Supreme Lord who previously bound the grain of sand. He then stretched out his hand and placed the grain of sand between his index finger and thumb. At that exact moment, the space around the grain of sand cracked. It continued until it reached the grain of sand. Crack. This Supreme Lord was an expert in a type of profound mystery of the space law, which was the heavenly destiny recorded in the crown of destiny. Thus, anything held between this Supreme Lord's fingers would be torn apart by space. Other than a few supreme divine weapons like the Saint's Sky Armor, there was nothing in the universe that could stop this shattering force. This Supreme Lord's lips twisted into a cold grin as the crack extended and quickly passed by the grain of sand. He was sure that this space treasure would definitely be destroyed. He withdrew his hands after a while and looked at the grain of sand. Suddenly, his eyes looked astonished. He hadn't had such a look in his eyes in more than 10,000 years ever since he'd been a supreme lord. The grain of sand that should have been shattered was still intact and quietly floated in the distance. His law of causality of shattering seemed to have no effect on it. "Ha ha, you failed," another supreme lord said as he shook his head. Then he stepped forward with two divine weapons in his hands, the golden demon awl, and the pure light hammer, which were ranked 52nd on the universe spirit tablet. The Supreme Lord suddenly pointed the golden demon awl at the grain of sand. Then, he swung the pure light hammer and smashed it heavily at the end of the golden demon awl. Boom, the crispiest hissing sound anyone had ever heard echoed out. While the sound wasn't too loud, it was heard through nearly half of the starry sky. Even some martial artists from other supreme worlds had clearly heard it. The Supreme Lords present were perfectly fine. However, the martial artists who were far away and cultivating within the stars felt as if their hearts were struck by a heavy blow. Their eyes dimmed and they spat out a mouthful of blood. The other martial artists who were weaker had their hearts broken apart. The collision between the two divine weapons was so strong that millions of lives even from faraway places were dead. There were very few martial artists in space, and only a handful of them lived on the stars. If the collision had taken place in a supreme world, trillions of living beings would have died. The sound the martial artists on the stars had heard was only the last bit of strength of the collision, but it was already immensely powerful. How much of a terrifying attack would this grain of sand in front of the golden demon awl withstand? A finger-sized spark shot out from the top of the golden demon awl. When the spark had dispersed, the grain of sand was still intact. All the Supreme Lords present were stunned. It was known that the Supreme Lords were the most powerful in the universe, even though there were countless incredible mysteries and many dangerous lands as well. They were all nothing in a Supreme Lord's eyes. Since they had lived for 100 million years and counting, it was hard for them to find anything that could surprise them. However, this grain of sand was out of their imagination. To add to that, they were also more interested in Zen's space treasure too. "Let me do it," Supreme Lord Renel said and stepped forward. Since he was a mid-rank Supreme Lord, he was far more powerful than the Supreme Lords who had previously tried. He already had a saber in his hands, the Imperial Mysterious Saber. This saber was refined from the last mysterious bone demon of the universe, and it was ranked 27th on the Universal Spirit Tablet. The mysterious bone demon had a special talent. It could disrupt the vitality between heaven and earth, and could even absorb an unlimited amount of it. It was because of this ability that the mysterious bone demons had been exterminated. Their race consumed far too much vitality between heaven and earth. It was something that the heavens couldn't tolerate. The last living mysterious bone demon had been captured by the ogres, weapon refiner, who had then created the Imperial Mysterious Saber out of it. The saber suddenly slashed out, and a crescent-shaped saber light appeared in the sky. As a result, the vitality between the heaven and earth in the sky was disrupted. It spread out everywhere in insanely fluctuating amounts. It was all too much to take. The vitality between heaven and earth contained in this saber light was far beyond the imagination of an ordinary martial artist. Whoosh! At that moment, the beam of saber light shot towards the grain of sand. Chapter 1165, Warning. There was a blinding flash as the Supreme Lord's saber swept through the air and accurately hit that single grain of sand. The moment the steel tip of his saber hit the grain, he noticed a hairline crack appear on his crescent blade light. In the end, his crescent blade light couldn't even swat the tiny grain away. The tremendous force of his slash was wasted and merely continued passing through half of the universe to pierce through thousands of stars before totally dissipating. The tiny grain of sand merely floated on the spot as it slowly rotated in the air. The results greatly dismayed Supreme Lord Renel. He was a mighty Supreme Lord, yet he couldn't even cause any damage to this tiny grain of sand. He raised his saber to try again, but another Supreme Lord stepped forward and indicated that it was now his turn to attack the sand grain. The Supreme Lords all took their turn trying to break this grain of sand one after another. They exhausted all of their abilities and used every kind of law of causality they knew, but to no avail. It wasn't just the Supreme Lords. Even Zen and Lavender, who currently hid within the fairy palace, were equally shocked at the extreme resilience of the sand grain. This fairy palace had always been Zen's final fort, a place where he could hide when things immediately went south for him, a sanctuary in times of desperation. He relied greatly on this fairy palace, but even he did not expect that it would be able to block even a mighty Supreme Lord's attack. He was extremely nervous earlier, but witnessing the Supreme Lords fail one after the other relieved him greatly. The strength of the palace wasn't something to be trifled with. It seemed that he had greatly underestimated his master and the origin of this fairy palace. He knew his master was someone who had surpassed the heavens, and this fairy palace was something extraordinary, but never to this extent. What exactly was the world above heavens like? And just how powerful was his master's cultivation base? It was something Zen couldn't really imagine. His thoughts then veered towards the man who had taken Yan away. Now that he thought about it, he realized that not even Lavender would stand any chance of defeating that man. The young man's strength far surpassed that of a supreme lord, which was the level Lavender's true strength was at. Someone above heavens, was he the true god? The conclusion left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he nonetheless found himself smiling. If that was really the case, then it seemed he had quite a long way to go if he wanted to see Yan again. Lavender floated quietly beside Zen, but the sparkle of excitement in her eyes was undeniable. She was equally shocked and awed by the fairy palace. She was 10 times more knowledgeable than Zen, but not even she could gauge the true power of the fairy palace. She didn't even think it was anything special at first. Now that she was witnessing its resilience firsthand, she finally understood that it was something way beyond her imagination. Outside the fairy palace, more than 20 supreme lords had already used whatever method they could think of to make the tiny grain budge, but none of them were successful. It was truly laughable how they were just threatening Zen a few moments ago. They never thought they'd end up being the powerless ones in this situation. Zen hid in this minuscule sand grain, but they could do nothing to him. Elena had the Saint Thunder meteor hammer in her hand, but silently dropped it while gazing at that tiny grain of sand. So many supreme lords had already tried their best, but it had all been in vain. She knew the power she could unleash with the help of the faith energy was going to be stronger, but she didn't think it would still be enough. There was a hint of resentment in Elena's eyes. Lavender's unintentional exposure of her position should have ended things smoothly. Elena thought that this was going to be the perfect opportunity for her to finally kill her rival queen, who remained as the final obstacle in her domination of the entire demon knight race. She didn't think that things were going to be a bit more complicated due to the protection of this mysterious fairy palace. If I let Zen go this time, he and Lavender will rely on this fairy palace to become stronger, she thought. Elena then found herself in a state of great crisis. She didn't fully know the origins of this fairy palace, but she knew that it was probably something far beyond her imagination. It was most likely filled with great resources that could increase Zen's strength in the future. If Zen managed to become a supreme lord, he'd surely help Lavender recover her strength. When that happened, Elena was sure to be doomed. No, I can't give up. I must break this space treasure today. Elena brandished the Saint Thunder meteor hammer in her hand and smashed it towards the grain of sand. A day had passed, but the supreme lords could now only stand and watch as the grain of sand spun slowly in place. The crown of destiny had made them come here, but this powerful space treasure that was the fairy palace completely captured their interest. Some of them had truly exhausted all means necessary to break the grain, with a few even using some very special laws of causality. In their desperation, one even used poison. The poison strategy greatly amused Zen. A supreme lord's poison was 1,000 times stronger than regular ones, but it still wasn't enough. This tiny grain of sand drove these supreme lords mad. Several more supreme lords arrived, and their number was now close to 30. They all came from different races and represented the different forces of the universe. Buzz. There was a slight buzzing sound as another burst of light signaled the arrival of another supreme lord. The light slowly condensed into a figure of a man, and the sight of his face changed the expressions on everyone's faces. Although the figure was of a man, this latecomer did not come from the human race but from the celestial position race. This race was peculiar and was a hybrid of many different races. Whether it was a human or some other member of another race, one would have to go through the prerequisite blood exchange to become a true celestial position member. It wasn't a large group, but every single member was powerful, especially their supreme lords. However, the race was also well known for being unreasonable. The arrival of a celestial position supreme lord meant that things here were about to get complicated soon enough. Supreme Lord Marcello, did the celestial position race also come to have a finger in the pie? Supreme Lord Renel asked with a sneer. Although the celestial position was effectively a multiracial group and was generally tolerant of the differences of their members' origins, their relationship with the ogres was extremely bad. Supreme Lord Marcello's gaze was hard and cold. What did you say? Have a finger in the pie? He scoffed and continued, our race has been involved from the very beginning, and yet we won't demand anything from the young man. What do you mean? Renel asked curiously. The other supreme lords listened intently, also perplexed by Marcello's words. The celestial position supreme lord pointed at the tiny grain of sand that slowly spun in space, because the young man in this space treasure is a member of our race. This declaration surprised and displeased the supreme lords present. A member of your race? I don't believe it. I'll say he's a member of the ogres then. Renelle snorted. The other Supreme Lords quickly sided with him. They were simply unwilling to believe Marcello's words. However, Marcello remained a picture of calm despite the disbelief from the other Supreme Lords. Zen passed our race's test and has obtained the Golden Celestial Position title. He is a significant member of our race. This revelation surprised the other Supreme Lords greatly. Golden Celestial Position titles were extremely rare and appeared only a few times during this grand era. However, they were quick to hide their surprise and replace it with their skeptic looks. Who knew if Marcello was merely speaking nonsense? Did he want to take this young man away with this casual excuse? What if his real agenda was to take the crown of destiny and the space treasure all to himself? In his dreams. So what if it's a Golden Celestial Position title? A Supreme Lord uttered with disdain. Marcello smiled, already catching on as to where this hostility was coming from. Don't worry, I'm not here to fight with you over the crown of destiny. Although it's important, our race doesn't take it that seriously. Another Supreme Lord snorted, you don't have to pretend to be so aloof. Just tell us why you came here. The Celestial Position was an unconventional race. They did not care about the expansion of their forces unlike the other races and often did things that an outsider couldn't understand. They had a habit of occasionally giving up some of their supreme worlds to share with other races, not to mention a few other crazier acts. I have something to say to everyone here, Marcello declared in an incredibly serious tone. What's it? Addison asked. If any of you dare to harm a single hair on Zen's head, then the Celestial Position race will not hesitate to kill you, even if you are a Supreme Lord. The declaration stunned the Supreme Lords present, but their surprise quickly evaporated with rage. Do you actually think you have the qualifications to threaten us? A Supreme Lord sneered. Do you think that the universe belongs to your race? Do you think you have the power to decide our fates? Another asked in a cold voice. Killing a Supreme Lord was no easy feat. A war amongst their ranks was no simple matter and often spelled disaster for the 100,000 Supreme Worlds. When two mighty Supreme Lords fought, countless lives often ended up being forfeited in the midst of the battle. But Marcello merely shrugged, it wasn't said by me. It came from the old man, the head of our race. The head of the Celestial Position race. The Supreme Lords immediately fell silent. The head of the Celestial Position race was a great figure. He was easily placed the same level as the leaders of the three greatest human forces, the Supreme Lord of Oracle, the Supreme Lord of Original Sin, and the Supreme Lord of Thunder Law, as well as the Demon Knight race's Supreme Lord Giovanni and the Ogres, Supreme Lord Matthias. These 6 leaders were the only top-ranked Supreme Lords in the entire universe. Their reactions were simply brushed off by Marcello. I also have a message for you, Zen, he said, looking towards the grain of sand. Our head hopes that you will pay a visit to our race when you have the time. It would be better if you come before the illusion battlefield begins. The old man has something important to discuss with you. After that, he shot a sideways glance to the other Supreme Lords before turning into a speck of light and disappearing from everyone's sight, leaving just as quickly as he came. It wasn't anything new. The members of the Celestial Position race were always like that. Back to the matter at hand. The Supreme Lords now knew they had to leave Zen alone lest they drew the ire of the Celestial Position race head. That old man's background was too mysterious and it would be unwise for them to provoke him. However, the Crown of Destiny and the Fairy Palace were still fair game. They did not care for Zen's life at all. Except maybe Elena. How could she kill Lavender without killing Zen after all? The Demon Knight race always had an amicable relationship with the Celestial Position race. Nearly 1/3 of the Demon Knight's young geniuses accepted the test and trials of the Celestial Position race before becoming famous. Some returned to the Demon Knight while the rest continued to stay in the Celestial Position race. This symbiotic relationship between the two races would no doubt come to an end if Elena killed Zen. She was now currently at a loss as to what she should do. Hey, human boy, did you hear that? The Celestial Position race will protect your life. You better leave that fairy palace now and we'll spare you. Otherwise, I'll cut off the vitality between heaven and earth and you'll be trapped inside there for 1,000,000 years. Remember, you're only at the Soul Sea realm. Your lifespan will not exceed 100,000 years. A Supreme Lord threatened. The Celestial Position race's warning did not deter them in the slightest to attain their goal. These Supreme Lords had endless time to confront Zen here. Do you really think the words of the Celestial Position race head would be enough to scare us? Renelle sneered. Let's see just how long you'll last, human boy. Zen's eyes flashed when he heard their threats. He quickly turned to Saul. Looks like there's no need for me to hesitate. Since these fellows are too stubborn, then just do as you've suggested earlier. Saul smiled. You are too merciful. It's no big deal to kill several Supreme Lords. What's more, their death would mean more crowns of destiny. I can't wait to see what interesting things will happen after that. As soon as he finished speaking, a beam of light suddenly shot out from the grain of sand. It had burst out so suddenly that the Supreme Lords didn't even have the time to react to it. Chapter 1166. Only one can survive. A black and white band of light appeared suddenly with a maximum speed. When the Supreme Lords finally realized what happened, the band of light had already connected the 5 Supreme Lords together. All of the Supreme Lords present stared at it without being able to recover from the surprise it had caused. Within the fairy palace, this band of light was released precisely from the pavilion in its center. It was also the desperate melee that Zen had inadvertently triggered when he first went to the fairy palace. Once the living creatures were trapped by it, only one of them would be able to survive. Is this desperate melee also effective on the Supreme Lords? Zen asked, looking at the band of light outside of the fairy palace. When Zen had entered the pavilion before, he had been tied up with a group of illuminating Soul Realm warriors. At that time, the illuminating Soul Realm warriors weren't able to break free. Would the same happen to the Supreme Lords? Saul smiled faintly. Why wouldn't it work? They are mere Supreme Lords and each of them only bears a heavenly destiny, so even they cannot escape its powerful force. Mere Supreme Lords, only a heavenly destiny. How can you say things like that so easily? Zen was shocked with his words. Judging from Saul's tone, he didn't think much of the Supreme Lords. Yes, this heavenly destiny is just a law of causality in the universe. With the rules contained in the desperate melee, if this group of Supreme Lords can break free, then they're really amazing. Saul looked extremely relaxed, as if he was not worried if the Supreme Lords would be freed from the desperate melee or not. The 5 Supreme Lords that were trapped on the desperate melee were Addison from the Ogre race, Gunter from the Demon Knight, Miles, and other 2 Supreme Lords. The Supreme Lords didn't reveal any emotions or show that they were worried about what was happening. Gunter was actually smiling. This band of light seems to be some sort of restriction. I can feel that it's transmitting an intention. I just can't figure out what it is exactly. I think it wants us to fight among ourselves. And only one of us will survive. Addison was stunned for a moment, and then his face revealed a sneer. This is actually funny. Miles gently waved his hand and ripples of water appeared on his hand. The water glowed and was about to cut the band of light in half. However, as this water glow passed through, the band of light remained the same. Miles frowned slightly. The other Supreme Lords also tried to use their own methods to destroy the band of light, which was only 2 fingers wide. But it remained intact and seemed to be able to withstand any attack. The 5 Supreme Lords were still chained to each other. All of the Supreme Lords started to feel intrigued by this band of light. There were too few things that could threaten their lives in this world. They were regarded as the invincible ones. They would find a way to be released from it. In the entire universe, the Supreme Lords could kill each other and there were only a few super legendary beasts that could threaten their lives. Except for that, no one could hurt or threaten them. But now, no matter what methods they used, the black and white band of light still emitted a faint halo. There were no energy waves being transmitted out or any reaction from it. Addison, being the oldest Supreme Lord, was the first one to realize that something was wrong. His figure flashed as he attempted to keep away from the band of light, but the band of light that was connected to his body extended with him, lengthening. The desperate melee's desolation is limited to a range of 100 miles. He can't run away and stay at a distance over 100 miles away, Saul said as he looked up at the sky. To a Supreme Lord, 100 miles was nothing more than a single step. When Addison dashed out and was 100 miles away, a strange thing occurred. A massive force suddenly appeared within the band of light and dragged Addison back. Addison was shocked, the uneasy expression stapled on his face. He knew how powerful he was. If he were to unleash his full strength, his fist could easily shatter a star. But at this moment, no matter how much he tried, he was unable to travel 100 miles. After he was dragged back, he breathed for a moment before both of his eyes once again widened. An extremely frightening power once again erupted from within his body. This force was enough to crush half of a supreme world. However, when he rushed out of the range of 100 miles, he was still dragged back. In this desperate melee, 100 miles became the law of causality of these 5 Supreme Lords. It was even stronger than the law of causality. It was impossible for them to go against it and escape. Seeing this, the remaining 4 Supreme Lords became frustrated. Gunter, Miles, and the other 2 Supreme Lords were similarly walking in different directions. The same thing happened to them. 100 miles was a range that none of them would be able to reach. Huff, huff, the 5 Supreme Lords gathered once again. They could see the shock on each other's face. They carried the heavenly destiny which represented the highest law of causality in the universe. However, this band of light had already surpassed them. It was beyond their knowledge and imagination. All of them wondered what kind of power it was. If you want to undo this black and white band of light, you need to kill each other. Only one of you can survive, said Zen, his voice spreading all over the universe again. When Zen's voice was heard, it shocked many of the living creatures in the universe. Earlier, trillions of living creatures in the universe were clear that many Supreme Lords seemed to have surrounded Zen. Many warriors sighed with emotion and wondered who on earth Zen was. He was only at the Soul Sea realm, but he could attract so many Supreme Lords to surround him. Those warriors thought that if they could become as powerful as Zen and attract so many Supreme Lords, it would be worth it even if they were killed by the Supreme Lords. But now they started to be a bit at a loss when they heard Zen's words. What did he mean? Let the 5 Supreme Lords kill each other. What does he mean that only one of them can survive? How did Zen do that? Within the Mist Palace, when Yolanda heard Zen's words, she immediately took a deep breath. When Zen was trapped this time, Yolanda did not try to help him. She never expected that after she let Zen go out for training, he would be able to find a crown of destiny and actually provoke dozens of Supreme Lords. If these dozens of Supreme Lords were to gather together, they would probably be able to destroy the whole alliance she was in. She wasn't capable of helping Zen once again. All she could do was to wait. She had never seen anyone who could cause so much trouble. If Zen provoked some spirit transformation realm warriors or even world lords, she would not hesitate to help Zen out. But now he was besieged by dozens of Supreme Lords, so she could not do anything about it. Now hearing Zen's voice, Yolanda was stunned again. What did he mean? She thought. Only one of the 5 Supreme Lords can survive. He wants to kill 4 Supreme Lords in one go. How did he make it so far? After Yolanda cultivated the Soul Split spell, her mind had become much stronger than that of the ordinary World Lord. When the warrior's cultivation of martial arts reached the extremes, training the mind was even more important than cultivating the martial arts. However, at this moment, Yolanda's mind was like a tide, churning and rolling, unable to calm down. Yolanda wasn't the only one who was so astonished. Many warriors who had heard of his name were confused about him. Those warriors included Master Shen and Master He from the Spiritual Force Sacred Place, the Saint Lord of the Spiritual Force Sacred Place, Lincoln who stayed in the Dark World, as well as the talents of the Mist Palace, such as Javier and Layla. They looked up to Zen's terrifying talent. They still regarded him as a Soul Sea Realm warrior. If he was just slightly stronger than them, they could still accept that. However, it had only been about half a year, and Zen was already able to go against Supreme Lords. Judging from Zen's tone of voice, it seemed like he was going to kill the 4 Supreme Lords without mercy. They were not the ordinary warriors, but 4 Supreme Lords. There were only a few Supreme Lords in the alliance. What is Zen doing? Layla was standing on a star in the western sky region. Purple ice crystals were scattered around her, and it was hard to tell what she was thinking. Zen, who she had once regarded as her greatest opponent, had grown to be so powerful in such a short amount of time. The polar region of the star was a perfect place to cultivate and gain experience. It was her master, Chiron, who had personally brought her up here. At this time, Chiron had also descended by Layla's side, and he was looking towards the middle sky region. His face was also filled with surprise as he said, he shouldn't be relying on his own strength. Perhaps he has some sort of trick up his sleeve. The illusion battlefield will begin in just a few years. Layla, you should focus on your cultivation. Chapter 1167, Groveling. This sort of conflict was not something that an ordinary martial artist could participate in. Yolanda was not apt to do it, and so was the case with Chiron. However, being incompetent did not mean that they did not pay heed to it. The 3 great human powers, the Humanity Alliance, the Thoughtless Minds, and the Blessed Buddha Land, were all watching closely. The Demon Knight, the Ogres, the Celestial Position, and the thousands of other upper world races were also paying close attention in silence. It could be said that the entire universe was focused on this place. On this day, they had memorized a name, and the name belonged to a warrior who was only at the Soul Sea realm. The faces of the Supreme Lords gradually darkened, revealing their frustration. As the other Supreme Lords looked at the black and white light band, they turned deathly pale. At the same time, they felt relieved that they had not been caught by it. The situation in front of them had suddenly turned chaotic. Among the 5 Supreme Lords, only one could live. These 5 Supreme Lords were closely related to the others. For example, Addison and Renell were from the same sect and race. If Addison decided to attack, Renell would undoubtedly help him out. Furthermore, if Supreme Lord Gunter were to make a move, Elena, Queen of the Demon Knight, would not just stand by and watch. The price of a duel to the death would be too high. It might even cause the entire universe to be thrown into turmoil. The trouble was that even after paying so much, they did not receive anything, owing to Zen's trickery. He was just some kid at the Soul Sea realm. How could the Supreme Lords be willing to accept this? The Supreme Lords present thought things through. They chose not to act. Instead, they looked toward the grain of sand. The black and white light band had come out of the grain. A faint smile rested on Addison's face. With one leap, he appeared right before the grain of sand. Just as he was about to open his mouth, he stopped, not knowing what to say. To plead with a nobody at the Soul Sea realm was indeed embarrassing for a Supreme Lord like Addison. After mulling over it for a while, he finally spoke up. "Your name is Zen, correct?" "Supreme Lord Addison, what is it?" Zen's indifferent voice resounded through the universe. Addison raised his head and looked at the sky. In his heart, he cursed Zen viciously. This kid apparently wants all creatures of the 100,000 Supreme Worlds to know that I'm groveling before him. In the end, to Addison, his life was more important than his dignity. The other 4 Supreme Lords watched with cautious expressions on their faces, wondering how this negotiation between Addison and Zen would turn out. "I see no point in using this desperate melee. Could you remove the black and white light band?" Addison used a gentle tone as he spoke to Zen, clearly placing a request. The ogres were known to be arrogant and ruthless. Even an ordinary martial artist of the race would not be so amiable, much less a Supreme Lord. Addison was indeed putting his dignity on the line. "Remove it. Hey, I do not have control over it, so naturally, there is no way to remove it," Zen replied once again, his voice echoing through the universe. Before deciding to release Desperate Melee, Zen had asked Saul if it could be revoked. The answer he got was a resounding no. Saul had told him that Desperate Melee had been devised by his master. Unless his master personally came here to remove it, only one person among the people confined within the light band would survive. Hearing Zen's answer, Addison took a slow deep breath. He was visibly disturbed. "You mean, only one person will survive? Only one Supreme Lord? There is no other way?" Zen's indifferent voice once again sounded like it came from the heavens. The faces of the other 4 Supreme Lords darkened at the same time. This was not the answer they had been hoping for. A faint killing intent was visible within Miles' eyes. If only one of them could outlive the others, then that person should be him. In this kind of situation, it was best to make the first move. Of course, at this moment, it was not only Miles that had the killing intent. So did the other Supreme Lords who had the same thoughts. Their lives were too precious. They had finally reached the top level of martial arts with much struggle and inherited their heavenly destinies. None of them was willing to be tricked and killed by Zen in such a manner. "Die, all of you must die. The one who lives should be me." Each of them was thinking along the same lines. But they still waited. After all, they only had 1 in 5 chances of surviving. They wanted to confirm if there were other ways to save themselves. If there were none, they could only fight. Right now, in the deep space below the middle sky region, the atmosphere crackled with apprehension. Although Addison had a faint smile on his face as he talked to Zen, he was still on his guard. Once the others took action, he should be prepared to protect himself. What if the 5 of us stay here for the rest of our lives? Addison gave this idea after thinking for a while. The black and white light band had confined these Supreme Lords, but it did not disturb their minds. What if they lived in harmony with each other? The lifespan of the Supreme Lords was unimaginably long. If they stayed here for 1,000,000 years, would the Desperate Melee's light band restrain them for that period of time? Hearing this question, Zen once again turned to Saul, who was standing to the side. As he explained the situation to Zen, Zen activated the roaring token. "The colors of this black and white light band will tell you the time you have left. When the white of the light band completely disappears and this band turns black, the 5 of you will die." As soon as Zen finished speaking, the Supreme Lords present focused their gazes on the black and white band of light. The black and the white, each occupied half of the area of the band. But if one looked carefully, they could see that the 2 colors were transforming quietly. The white on the light band was slowly being eroded by the black. At first, the black and white had taken up equal spaces on the band. In a short time, the black had occupied 60% of the area, while the white was constantly shrinking. Now, only about 40% of the band was white. "How long do we have?" Addison asked again. 6 hours, Zen replied. No one could say for sure whether or not this black ribbon would take the lives of the 5 Supreme Lords, but they were not willing to take the risk of testing it when their lives were at stake. Thus, just as Zen finished speaking, someone could not help but take action. The first to attack was Miles. A faint water pattern appeared on his body and a water ring appeared behind him. A spine-chilling aura began to emit outward. Whoosh! Miles' first target was Addison himself. Miles had considered it before making a move against Addison. He was a mid-rank Supreme Lord and was stronger than the 4 in front of him. If there were only the 5 of them without the other 20-odd Supreme Lords watching, then his chances of winning would undoubtedly be the greatest. But Supreme Lord Renell was still backing Addison up. Renell was also a mid-rank Supreme Lord who was not weaker than Miles. Sooner or later, Miles would face Addison, and Renell would help the latter. Rather than leaving Addison to the last, it would be better to kill him first. Once Addison died, Renell would be upset, but he might not act on it. This was why he chose Addison to be his first target. Amongst the Supreme Lords, Addison feared Miles the most. He also had a plan in his head. Once the Supreme Lords were almost done fighting, he would fight the survivor together with Renell. This way, his chances of victory would be much higher. However, he had not expected Miles to choose him first. It was obvious from Addison's face that he was both shocked and angry. As soon as Miles moved, Gunter attacked at the same time. As for the other 2 Supreme Lords, they were not slow either. When a Supreme Lord attacked, the power released was very intimidating. The battle of these Supreme Lords was enough to shatter a Supreme world. What was more, they were bound within 100 miles. Boom! With a deafening explosion, the battle finally began. Chapter 1168. Die one after another. As the battle began, nearly 20 of the Supreme Lords retreated at the same time in great haste, afraid that they would be caught up in the conflict. As for Elena, Renell, and the other Supreme Lords, not only did they not leave, but they even charged forward at this moment. In the realm of World Lords, it was difficult to determine the victor in a battle between these warriors. The reason was that the World Lord had basically comprehended the spatial transference, and perhaps he wouldn't be able to beat his opponent, but it wasn't difficult for him to escape. After using the skill of spatial transference, the warrior had already traveled 1 million miles in only a moment. He was in a sense therefore unreachable. There had once been 2 world lords who had fought and chased each other for over 10 years, and they had traveled through 100,000 supreme worlds. There was no way to delineate the battle zone, when the combatants could disappear in an instant. As for the battle between 2 supreme lords, one of them could defeat the other. But it would be impossible for the supreme lord to kill the other if the opponent wanted to escape. A Supreme Lord would be killed unless there were several Supreme Lords working in collusion, or if the few top-ranked Supreme Lords that had the highest law of causality were involved. But now, the 5 Supreme Lords were trapped in a desperate melee within the open range of 100 miles. Whether they made use of the spatial transference, their special fleeing skill, or other methods, they were unable to escape from the band of light which bound them, nor were they able to leave the area of 100 miles. Despite these restrictions, they were able to jump around within this massive battle zone. Since the very start of the Grand Era, nothing like this had probably ever happened before. As such, battles within 100 miles were exceptionally fierce. Zen and Lavender, who were standing within the fairy palace, silently looked up into the sky. This grain of sand which the fairy palace had transformed into was located in the very center of the battle. It was a whole new experience to have front row seats. In the sky, there was a dramatic play of all sorts of illusory colors and lights. Other than that, it was practically impossible to see anything else. Zen simply couldn't understand this level of battle. The scope was too massive. The only thing he could discern was that those extremely profound water laws were being created by Miles. As for the shredded shadows, they might be from Gunter of the Demon Knight. Even if he couldn't understand it, and could only distinguish the law power, the massive light around Zen still gave him a great shock. It was mind-boggling to observe the mammoth-scale battle. As for Lavender, her face was instead filled with extreme excitement. "Will Elena die here?" Lavender asked indifferently. If Elena died here, it would be a release for Lavender. Her enemy would then have been dealt with. Even though Zen had personally promised to help her kill Elena, there were a lot of risks and consequences involved in this undertaking. Lavender knew that Zen would definitely do what he had vowed, but, right now, she seemed to have the intention of preventing Zen from taking that risk. Lavender was the queen of killings, and her will was forged through slaughter. The faith energy she absorbed was mainly from slaughter, containing the most primitive killing intent of the Demon Knight members. But now, even she was hesitant. It was a pity that Elena wasn't also trapped inside the light band of the desperate melee. This band of light had been set up by the owner of the fairy palace and was not under anyone's control. It was a move that Saul had come up with at a whim, so it was not unnatural that Elena hadn't gotten trapped in it. Boom, bam, buzz, buzz. In this blazing light, there were all sorts of sounds reverberating across the space. Slowly, the space began to crumble and vanish, little by little. It was hard to imagine the scope of the power spreading. Miles released the light of still water, which was a form of light arrow that was about 3 feet wide, but possessed an infinite length. Every light of still water stretched from both ends to the deep space. One end of the light of still water pierced straight to the top of the universe, and the other end went straight through the sky, piercing into a supreme world. There might be many innocent creatures who were being killed. As for Addison, each time he launched the Dark Star Fist, a massive black hole would form in the air above them. That black hole would suddenly appear, sucking into it all of the surrounding energy and light. Every Supreme Lord was trying their best to fight. There was no regard for the cost of this titanic battle. But the Supreme Lords' life energy and defensive capabilities were too great. Even though they had endured such a terrifying attack, none of the Supreme Lords had died in the initial short period of time. 2 hours later, the heavens began to tremble again. More than 20 Supreme Lords outside of the battle raised their heads at the same time, their faces filled with both amazement and shock. Although they couldn't clearly see what was happening on the battlefield, they knew that a Supreme Lord had now been killed. If a Supreme Lord died, the heavenly destiny would lose its position, and would inevitably cause the heavens to shake. Soon, a new heavenly destiny would be turned into the crown of destiny, which would randomly appear in any far-flung corner of the universe. 1 hour later, the heavens began to tremble once again. A second Supreme Lord has been killed, Supreme Lord Helm from the core sacred place of the Humanity Alliance said in a bleak voice which matched his cold face. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes. Zen, who Yolanda had thought so highly of, had already tricked and killed 2 Supreme Lords. After 5 minutes, the heavens shook once more. A third Supreme Lord died. In less than 5 minutes, the fourth Supreme Lord also perished. A Supreme Lord could live for over 100 million years. If he used some additional method, it wasn't too difficult to live for 200 million, or even 300 million years. They were in a real sense close to being immortal. Before this, it had been a long time since any of the Supreme Lords had died. But today, in just 4 short hours, 4 Supreme Lords had perished. They had fought each other, and had been killed during the battle. Strictly speaking, they had been tricked and killed by Zen. Elena crossed her legs, floating in the air. Although her expression was calm and composed, she still looked extremely miserable. Excessive consumption of faith energy was a tremendous blow to her as well, and it left her drained. On the Saint Thunder meteor hammer in her hand, a crack, 2 fingers in width, had appeared. The Saint Sky armor draped over her body was all but destroyed. The heart-protecting mirror on her chest had already cracked in half, and the spikes of the armor's shoulder guard had also completely shattered. The pair of boots that had wrapped around her legs had already been completely torn apart, and there was a shocking, gaping wound on the side of her thigh. Fresh blood flowed down from the wound to drip on top of her toes, drop by drop. Before the blood reached the surface of the Supreme World, it had already been air-dried and had dissipated in the wind. Elena had tried her best, but she still couldn't save Gunter. In truth, Gunter was the third Supreme Lord to have perished. After Gunter died, Elena left the center of the battle. The fighting there was just too intense, and even Elena couldn't withstand the frenzied attacks of the gathered Supreme Lords. She had personally made a trip there. She would never have thought that not only would she fail to exterminate Lavender and obtain the Crown of Destiny, but she also lost Gunter in the battle. From that point on, the Demon Knight had then lost one more Supreme Lord. The Board of Elders' head had also died. Losing one more Supreme Lord had a great influence on the Demon Knight. Because of this, if Elena returned to the Demon Knight, she would probably be held accountable for the loss and failure by the other 2 Supreme Lords. Elena let out a deep sigh. At this moment, a strong feeling of helplessness overwhelmed her mind. Zen and Lavender were so close to her, yet she couldn't do anything to them. It was galling. She could do nothing but give up for the time being. Elena was really unwilling to accept the fact. Defeat was not a word she was used to. Right now, it wasn't just she who was disappointed and indignant. Of the 5 Supreme Lords, 4 had perished. A Supreme Lord represented a race, and with that Supreme Lord's support, that race could grow stronger within the 100,000 Supreme Worlds of the universe. After the 4 Supreme Lords had died, how could the members of the races which were supported by them be willing to submit to such a situation? Chapter 1169, Heading North. Supreme Lord Miles was the only one who had survived among the 5 Supreme Lords. However, his aura was declining and his face was as pale as a sheet right at this moment. As a mid-rank Supreme Lord, his strength might be slightly higher than the other 4 Supreme Lords. Nonetheless, one's strength was no longer important in such a chaotic battle. The only thing he relied on to survive was a wisp of luck. Supreme Lord Miles stared at the grain of sand with lingering fear. He had to admit that Zen truly had the qualifications to be so arrogant by relying on the fairy palace. All of the Supreme Lords deliberately maintained a certain distance from that grain of sand, afraid that they would once again be caught by that black and white light band. On the other hand, Supreme Lord Renell had a sullen face. He had joined the fight earlier to save Supreme Lord Addison. It was unfortunate that he failed to save him and even got himself severely injured in the process. However, unlike all the other Supreme Lords who stayed far away from this grain of sand, Supreme Lord Renell even approached it alone. His face was cold as he sneered, "The desperate melee is truly amazing. It is indeed beyond imagination. But I'm here alone, so you are unable to use the desperate melee on me, right?" Supreme Lord Renell was probing. He already knew that the desperate melee was just an array that would cause all living things bound up to kill each other. This type of array was not rare in the upper world. Many great races had arrays with similar functions. For example, if 100 people entered the 101 array together, only one person would survive. This person could also absorb the energy of other people's flesh and blood to strengthen his or her own body. This was the Ogre's array to cultivate their elite warriors. The only one to survive the brutality would be an elite warrior. The Slaughter Feast array had the same effect. It was being used by the upper world's blood spirit race. However, normal arrays had no effect on Supreme Lords or even World Lords. That black and white light band just now was something that not even Supreme Lords could break free from. This was truly unbelievable. Zen looked at the overbearing Supreme Lord Renell, a smile on his face. "Yes, I'm unable to use the desperate melee on you alone. But what is the use of you standing here? Are you planning to guard here forever?" he asked. Supreme Lord Renell snorted. "There is no need for me to guard this place. A mere Soul Sea Realm warrior like you isn't worth dealing with personally. I will only send a World Lord to guard this place. I'm afraid you will never be able to leave this fairy palace for the rest of your life." The other Supreme Lords also agreed after hearing Supreme Lord Renell's words. Tricking and killing 4 Supreme Lords was a heinous crime. How could they tolerate Zen after he did such? Of course, they wouldn't let him go that easily. With how the situation looked like, Zen's only method to deal with them was to use the desperate melee. It might be powerful, but then it would be utterly useless if there was only one warrior guarding that place. Thus, sending just one person there to guard would mean that Zen couldn't leave the fairy place. This was probably the Supreme Lord's only method to deal with Zen. Therefore, Supreme Lord Renell's suggestion immediately attracted the support of many other Supreme Lords. After a simple discussion, each of the Supreme Lords agreed to dispatch a World Lord of their respective races to take turns in guarding the fairy palace. Among everyone present, the one with the strongest killing intent towards Zen was naturally Elena. She immediately called Tanya and Maddox over. The 2 Demon Knight warriors had been thrown away by Supreme Lord Addison, but they did not leave and instead maintained a relatively far distance from the Supreme Lords as they observed the fairy palace. Hearing the Queen's summons, the 2 of them rushed over as soon as possible. Both of them were the first ones to see the mini fairy palace. After the 2 of them forced Zen out of the reincarnation plate, he then stepped into the mini fairy palace. Nonetheless, Tanya and Maddox weren't thinking much about the mini fairy palace at that time. They were under the impression that they could simply destroy the fairy palace after they had destroyed the reincarnation plate. Unfortunately, Supreme Lord Addison came and threw them away. They were full of desperation and self-blame back then as they failed to complete the mission assigned by their queen. As the situation slowly evolved, the 2 of them realized that the mini fairy palace was not something that they could deal with. Even the Supreme Lords had suffered great loss in dealing with the fairy palace. 4 Supreme Lords had already died. Some Supreme Lords were already leaving when they heard Elena summon them. On the surface, these Supreme Lords said that they would send World Lords of their respective races to take turns on watching Zen. However, their true intentions were obvious. Sending a World Lord to guard this fairy palace was just a small matter. These Supreme Lords already had other motives. 4 Supreme Lords had been killed today. Not long from now, the crowns of destiny that disappeared with the 4 Supreme Lords would appear again. They were sure that the crowns would appear randomly in the corners of the universe. Zen's mini fairy palace only had one crown of destiny, and that crown of destiny didn't seem to be of the right origin. After all, it was the 129th crown of destiny in the universe. Nonetheless, the deaths of the 4 Supreme Lords caused 4 more crowns of destiny to be of no owners. 4 crowns of destiny were enough to create 4 new Supreme Lords. It was enough to change the fates of many races. Having been arranged by Elena to guard this place, Maddox and Tanya also felt reluctance. Both of them possessed the strength of a Grand World Lord, and their biggest dream was to become a Supreme Lord. For Zen's crown of destiny, Elena had placed the 2 of them here to guard Zen. Naturally, they did not have a share of the 4 crowns of destiny. One had to know that there were still thousands of world lords that wanted to obtain a crown of destiny within Demon Knight alone. The 2 of them were the elite warriors among these world lords. Although they were unwilling, they couldn't defy the imperial order. Elena left wordlessly after making this arrangement for them. Honestly, she still couldn't accept her defeat. Lavender just came back to the upper world and she had made Elena's follower, a Supreme Lord, lose his life. However, Elena hadn't even seen Lavender. Elena was more than sure that she would face the questioning of the Board of Elders once she returned to the Demon Knight's base. The other 2 Supreme Lords of the Demon Knight would also come to her and ask about this thing. The only way left for Elena to take back the losses was to take back a crown of destiny. She swore in her mind that she must obtain one of the 4 crowns of destiny. All of the Supreme Lords left in a few hours. The Middle Sky region had once again returned to silence. For a while, there was only the deafening emptiness radiating across the universe. It was an indescribable humiliation for any Supreme Lord to return with a defeat in front of a Soul Sea Realm warrior. No one was willing to use the roaring tokens at this moment. Maddox was guarding the grain of sand. He didn't try to attack it. Even a Supreme Lord was unable to break through the fairy palace, and he was also unable to do so. To be safe, Maddox had even stayed several hundred miles away from Tanya. Otherwise, the light band of the desperate melee would lock the 2 of them, causing one of them to die. At this moment, a faint luster appeared on the surface of the grain of sand. The originally slowly rotating grain of sand began to rapidly spin, gradually expanding into a palm-sized fairy palace. This mini fairy palace continued expanding. Maddox stared at the constantly changing fairy palace without even a blink. The tiny thing had expanded all the way until it transformed into its original size. Both his and Tanya's expressions grew complex. He couldn't help but sigh. There was actually such a precious treasure in this universe. Whoosh! After the fairy palace had been restored to its original size, it continued to flee towards the north. Maddox and Tanya glanced at each other from afar and followed behind the fairy palace. Their goal wasn't to destroy the fairy palace but to keep Zen inside it. Wherever the fairy palace ran, they would follow. Inside the fairy palace, Zen had already entered a meditative state and began a new round of cultivation. The power of the fairy palace came from his master, which was also the first owner of the fairy palace. In other words, its power wasn't his. It was impossible for him to stay in the fairy palace for his entire life. However, Supreme Lord Renel's words had brought him some trouble. If they really sent their world lords to take turns to guard outside the fairy palace, it would be equivalent to isolating Zen from the outside world. He wouldn't be able to step out of the fairy palace. At this moment, Zen couldn't think of a way to solve it. If he were to leave the fairy palace now, he would be killed instantly by the 2 Demon Knight world lords. He could only make the fairy palace move towards the northern sky region. Another voice suddenly echoed around him just as he entered his meditative state. Chapter 1170. How to obtain a satisfying heavenly destiny. Hi guys, I seem to have missed something interesting. It was the laughter of a young girl. Zen had heard this voice before. The first time he had used the roaring token, this girl had replied to him and sung a beautiful song. She had then fallen silent for more than a year. But at this moment, the young girl's voice unexpectedly resounded throughout the universe. No big deal, I was just surrounded and attacked by a bunch of Supreme Lords, Zen replied with his roaring token. He was just surrounded and attacked by a bunch of Supreme Lords. Zen's indifferent tone rendered all the intelligent creatures in the universe speechless. And angered the Supreme Lords who were rushing back to their own races. But what difference did it make? It was impossible to pull Zen out of the fairy palace, and they could do nothing about it. Zen not only had an indestructible space treasure, he also had a roaring token that could be used an unlimited number of times. They were upset enough that they couldn't do anything about Zen, and now he was even bragging about it. The Supreme Lords felt a grievance they had never felt before. Awesome, The mysterious girl praised. Zen looked on indifferently as he placed the roaring token before him. He wouldn't respond to the girl if it wasn't absolutely necessary. He had nothing to do with her, and the two of them had only communicated with each other once by using their roaring tokens. But Zen understood that the roaring token in the girl's hand could be used an unlimited number of times, just like his own. Zen's roaring token was given to him by his master and was not a product of the current round of heavens. The roaring token in his hand and the fairy palace were both products that surpassed the heavens. Thus, Zen guessed that this girl was not from the universe. She might also be an existence that surpassed the heavens. The only reason Zen wanted to communicate with her was to track down Yan. You are just being modest. These were a group of supreme lords. They are the supreme existences in the universe. Let me see. The heavenly destiny of shadows, the heavenly destiny of darkness, the heavenly destiny of strength, and the heavenly destiny of earth. These four are missing. You really are amazing. All the supreme lords and the world lords were startled at the girl's words. Her origins had always been a mystery. She would use the roaring token to sing, causing beast attacks. In any case, many supreme lords knew that this girl had an extraordinary background, and that she was a character they couldn't afford to offend. But they just didn't know enough about her. There was no supreme lord that would waste roaring tokens in meaningless conversations with her. There weren't that many roaring tokens in the universe, after all. The girl had just casually pointed out the four missing heavenly destinies. This was truly unbelievable. Carrying a heavenly destiny was in truth carrying a law of causality in the universe. A supreme lord that carried a law of causality was an absolute authority in this domain, and was able to control the ultimate strength of this sort of law. The heavenly destiny of shadows used to be carried by Supreme Lord Gunter, which was why he had controlled the most powerful shadow-splitting technique in the entire universe. Theoretically speaking, he could split his own shadow into countless parts and fill the entire universe. But while this method could be used to exterminate an entire race or a supreme world, it wasn't too useful in dealing with other supreme lords. After all, no matter how many shadows there were, they were still inferior to Supreme Lord Gunter himself. This didn't mean that Supreme Lord Gunter was weak. It was just that the heavenly destiny he had previously carried was rather weak. When the 5 Supreme Lords had been fighting, Supreme Lord Gunter had created countless shadows. This would help him hide his whereabouts. But the moment these shadows had appeared, they had been drawn into the attacks of the other Supreme Lords and completely annihilated. In the end, Supreme Lord Gunter had been killed. The Supreme Lord that had carried the heavenly destiny of darkness had mastered the extremes of the Dark Law. The heavenly destiny of strength and the heavenly destiny of earth both had their own miraculous uses, but in the end, they were still the weaker laws of causality. After the 4 Supreme Lords had been killed, the heavenly destinies they had carried would have been removed from the heavens and transformed into 4 brand new crowns of destiny. Every time a new crown of destiny appeared, there would be a new heavenly destiny and a new law of causality. This new law of causality could be either a low-rank one or a top-rank one. If a world lord obtained a top-rank law of causality, they could take a leap and become a top-rank supreme lord, the strongest in the entire universe. This could change the fate of an entire race. The celestial position race had used this rule to become the top race in the universe. In the beginning, there were 2 supreme lords in the celestial position race. One of them carried the heavenly destiny of rebirth. The corresponding law of causality of the heavenly destiny of rebirth could revive those who had died. This law of causality was not particularly strong and didn't have much of an effect during battles. But back then, in the celestial position race, an extremely powerful world lord had appeared and received the title of the Golden Celestial Position from the Talent Tablet. This world lord had been waiting for a long time for the chance to obtain a crown of destiny and carry the heavenly destiny. This world lord had waited for close to 200,000 years when one of the supreme lords finally died, and the world lord seized his chance. The members of the celestial position had successfully obtained the crown of destiny for him. The world lord had successfully carried the heavenly destiny, but the result wasn't satisfactory. Since he had merely obtained a low-rank law of causality, he would only be a low-rank supreme lord his entire life. And because of this, the celestial position members killed him. Following this, the supreme lord who carried the heavenly destiny of rebirth resurrected him. After he died, the heavens shook and the crown of destiny dissipated. After being revived, he became a world lord again. Not long after, the crown of destiny appeared again, and was captured yet again by the celestial position race. This man carried the heavenly destiny again but was still not satisfied as the second law of causality he had obtained was still a low-rank one. The members of the celestial position killed him, and the Supreme Lord revived him again. He then carried the heavenly destiny again. The celestial position race had made full use of this rule to obtain all sorts of strange laws of causality. For example, he had obtained a law of causality that could see through everyone and a law of causality that could control the movements of stars. He had once even obtained the heavenly destiny of sound. It was similar to a roaring token and could make his voice heard across the whole universe. The roaring token was a precious treasure, but if a Supreme Lord's special talent was the same as a roaring token, this was not acceptable. Most crowns of destiny wouldn't be of much use to the celestial position race. This had been repeated 13 times, and the crown of destiny also dissipated and was reborn 13 times. On the 14th time, the celestial position race finally obtained a top-rank law of causality, which was also the strongest one in the universe. It finally allowed this world lord to become a top-rank Supreme Lord. He had finally become the leader of the celestial position race, and had led the race to this day. Other powerful races followed suit once the celestial position race had used this rule. For example, the ogres, the demon knight race, and the humans all wanted to use this method to create a top-rank Supreme Lord. Resurrection of the dead was a very difficult task, but many races could do it, albeit at a high cost. It was just not as easy as it was for the celestial position race. After obtaining a crown of destiny, the thoughtless minds, a human force, picked out a world lord to carry the heavenly destiny and become a Supreme Lord. They weren't satisfied with this heavenly destiny, so like the celestial position race, they killed the Supreme Lord and planned to revive him. Only then did they find they couldn't revive him. The ogres and the demon knight had also done the same experiment. They all came to the same conclusion that once a warrior carried a heavenly destiny, he or she couldn't be revived after being killed. The same method had produced completely different results. After much deliberation, many Supreme Lords came to the same conclusion. It seemed that after the celestial position race had used this rule to cheat, the heavens had changed this rule. This loophole no longer existed. But this also illustrated a problem. The round of heavens had its own thoughts, and it seemed to be constantly repairing itself. Or it could be said that someone was managing the heavens. When this person discovered this loophole, he or she changed the rule to prevent these Supreme Lords from using such a method to obtain top-rank laws of causality. Who was this person? Where was this person? This had always been a mystery. But this mysterious girl was able to know every single one of the heavenly destinies like the back of her hand. Was she the manager of the heavens? Judging from the fact that her singing could cause massive beast attacks to erupt in 100,000 supreme worlds, combined with her infinite usage of the roaring token, many Supreme Lords unanimously came up with this answer. Zen didn't know the story, so Lavender told him about it. Then he understood it in an instant. If this mysterious girl was the manager of the heavens, he would ask her Yan's whereabouts. However, before he could say anything, the other Supreme Lords burst out, unable to restrain themselves. Young lady, you did not come personally. How do you know which Supreme Lords died and which heavenly destinies vanished? A Supreme Lord asked, using the roaring token. The girl giggled. Do you want to know the answer? Yes, the Supreme Lord said. But I won't tell you, she replied. You bunch of old guys won't beg that of me, right? At her words, the Supreme Lords scattered throughout the 100,000 Supreme Words fumed in sullen anger. But none of them scolded her, since they knew that they could afford to offend neither Zen nor her. They could only swallow the humiliation and say nothing in return. Ha ha, Zen laughed at the girl's answer. What are you laughing at? The girl turned her attention to Zen. Zen smiled and said, nothing. Hey, can you do me a favor? What Zen had never expected was the girl to take the lead before he could say anything. Looking for Yan Luo, right? She said. Zen's heart sped up at the indication that she knew something. Yes, I am looking for a woman called Yan Luo. Do you know where she is? Although his voice was calm, truth was that he was extremely excited, and it was hard to conceal his excitement. But the girl's next sentence filled Zen with disappointment. I don't know. It's just that you said that you were looking for her the last time, she said, seeming to sense Zen's mood. At this, not only were the Supreme Lords infuriated, even Zen wanted to scold her. Lavender snorted. She looked up at the sky and said, ignore her. She's just another stupid woman. Zen shrugged and prepared to put away the roaring token. But the mysterious girl said something that stopped him short. I can ask around for you. But I have a condition. Chapter 1171. Tell a story. Seriously. Ask around. A condition. Zen was about to put away the roaring token when he heard the girl's words. A glimmer of hope then appeared in his eyes and his whole body turned frigid without warning. He ended up grabbing the roaring token and activated it. So, you're going to lend me a hand? Zen asked, feeling a bit enthusiastic. Yes, but the best I can do is to ask around for you. There's no telling whether I'll actually be able to find Yan or not, the peculiar girl replied. You mentioned something about having one condition. What is the condition? Zen asked again, with his stomach about to be tied into knots. Right now, lots of things were running through his head as he tried to weigh things out. What kind of demands could this mysterious girl ask for? He would do what he could. The thing was, at the moment, he couldn't really leave this fairy palace. If this mysterious girl would require him to take care of a few things, he might end up failing to complete his mission, which could be quite problematic for him. But he would try to come up with something. This was about Yan. There was no way he would give up that easily. After a period of silence, the mysterious girl let out a soft chuckle. There is only one condition. I want you to tell me a story. I'll die of boredom staying here. Plop. The second he heard her request, Zen quickly planted his forehead into the ground. Slowly lifting his head up from the floor, he was at 6s and 7s whether he should laugh or cry. With another shrug of her shoulders, Lavender flatly remarked, as I've said before, this woman is stupid. But it wasn't just Zen who had no idea if he should laugh or cry. Apart from him, there were also over 100 Supreme Lords, several 100,000 World Lords, and the trillions of living and breathing beings within this universe. A little storytelling with the roaring token. Could there possibly be anything more luxurious than that in the entire universe? Zen may be the only person who can pull that off. As a rule of thumb, a Supreme Lord would usually have just a little over 100 roaring tokens. Without a shadow of doubt, they would have probably used up all of their roaring tokens already before they could wrap up a single story. That should go without question. She happens to find the perfect person to do something like that. Still though, how bored could this woman really be for her to come up with such a request? Both large and small races alike had been taken by surprise by this woman's bizarre request. Little did Zen know that this mysterious girl was just genuinely getting bored to death from staying in this universe. Massaging his forehead, Zen stopped for a second and took a deep breath. This request might have really been so preposterous beyond belief, but he still managed to pull through in the end. Setting aside the identity of this woman, given the fact that she would ask around for Yan's current whereabouts, he was willing to throw caution to the wind and do whatever she said, let alone tell her a story. To other people, this might seem like such a challenging request to fulfill. All things considered, roaring tokens were as rare as hen's teeth. But that was not the case for Zen, however. No matter what, this story needed to be told. Lightly breathing in, he paused for a while to prepare himself. Zen had started reading at such a young age. And as a matter of fact, he had actually read a substantial amount of good books such as The 7 Heroes and 5 Gallants and The Legend of Ghosts and Demons. And in spite of the fact that it had been such a long time since he read those books, he still remembered how the story went a little bit. Just as he was about to start, his eyebrows became deeply knit. Even though he still had the gist of how the story should go, he would still have a bit of a hard time recounting the tale from the very beginning. Because after all, he had ventured into the road of martial arts at such a young age. And as soon as that happened, he just didn't have the time to read these works of fiction anymore. Wait a second, Zen's face seemed to have lightened up. He might not be able to depend on his memories, but he remembered that he still possessed the memories of the great world. That orb of memories consisted of all the memories of the entire great world. Using these memories, he would be able to easily search for some good stories. As soon as this thought popped up in his mind, memories of these stories began surging toward him like a tidal wave. With the size of the great world he had come from, it was a given that there were a great many stories which even Zen had never read or heard of. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the story that was being passed on the most from generation to generation in the great world he was from was also the most well-known. The story was entitled, The Heroic Wife. He ultimately decided to pick that one. Upon activating the roaring token, Zen stated, if you can really help me find a way to get to Yan, then I'd gladly tell you a great story. Of course, the mysterious girl softly responded. A long time ago, there was a mountain known by all as the Mountain of Lady Yu. At the very foot of the mountain. This story, The Heroic Wife, in particular took place around a millennia ago. It had been widely spread all throughout the 4 divine kingdoms. Zen had never actually read it before in his life, and now, he was reading it word for word as he perceived and from the memories in his head. His faint voice could be heard resounding in every part of the vast universe. Even though he was giving an account of this story directly to the mysterious girl, the living beings in the universe had no way to steer clear of the sound of the roaring token. For that reason, trillions of lives were forced to listen in on his story. It was the first time that a man was heard telling a story to all living beings in the universe. Zen read it aloud part by part based from his memory. In dribs and drabs, his attention became riveted on the story. In all sincerity, this story was indeed truly captivating. It was about the tale of a woman from the state of Yu whose husband had been falsely incriminated by a traitor. Because of that, she made an oath to make the culprit pay at all costs. The chain of events kept a lot of the listeners on the edge of their seat. Zen had been at it for 2 hours already without stopping, yet he had barely even covered half of the overall story. The woman's sword attack brought about a series of events. At this point in the story, it had come to its most crucial juncture. Every creature that could breathe in the universe were idly listening to Zen's supposedly gripping story. But because of the varying cultures and languages all over the universe, there were bound to be a few of those who might not have the faintest idea what he was blabbering about. Be that as it might, a great deal of creatures had been listening to it attentively. And it wasn't just the ordinary mortals, but even Soul Sea Realm warriors, world lords, and even a number of supreme lords who had been pricking their ears, tuning into Zen's story. When he finally stopped talking, the entire universe felt as though it had reached a moment of tranquility. One thing he had no way of knowing was that the moment he stopped, numerous creatures of the supreme world started uttering profanities left and right. Heck, that bonehead stopped right in the middle of the story. You've gotta be kidding me. Either you never bothered starting it, or you continue it till the end. What is this? I don't have any roaring tokens, but if I did, I would certainly call this guy some bad names. It's just a false pretense of an otherwise legendary story. Is there a real need for you to get so worked up about it? The reason why Zen had stopped all of a sudden wasn't really because he could not continue anymore. It just so happened that Freya had left the library and was heading towards him to get some advice on a few things regarding cultivation. Thank heavens, the mysterious girl was surprisingly very patient and didn't put the screws on him. However, after a while, another voice from the universe resounded out of the blue. What happened next? Tell me, what happened to the woman's sword? This voice belonged to a supreme lord. They had barely heard about half of the story. Even so, this supreme lord became so engrossed in it that he resorted to using the roaring token just to ask Zen. Any way you looked at it, a supreme lord was originally immortal. They had not yet reached the true god level. Despite their mental states being much stronger as opposed to that of a normal martial artists, the twists and turns of this story still somehow managed to tug at their heartstrings. The minute he heard this supreme lord's query, Zen was left utterly dumbfounded. Only then did he finally realize that apart from the mysterious girl, there were countless others who had been listening to his story. As a smile crept onto his face, Zen simply replied, "Just wait a moment, I'll continue the story later." Can't you do it sooner? Don't just stop at such a crucial part. You're leaving me hanging. One more supreme lord used the roaring token to urge him to continue telling the story without delay. Why are you dawdling? The voices of several supreme lords echoed all over the universe. They actually ended up taking turns trying to urge him to continue. Why are you pressing him? I'm the only one Zen's supposed to be telling the story to. As far as I'm concerned, he's free to continue any time he wants. Why are you kicking up a stink? The mysterious girl, on the other hand, sounded off on Zen's behalf. In truth, Zen couldn't care less about these supreme lords urging him to go on. He leisurely talked with Freya about a few things. And after about an hour, he raised the roaring token once again. Now I'm ready to continue where we left off. After that unforeseeable event which had befallen her husband, she didn't care about her own life anymore. The rest of the story was narrated for 6 hours straight. When it finally got to the exceedingly tragic but beautiful scene, even Zen himself couldn't help but feel touched deep inside. It was quite possible that the cultivation base and strength of the martial artists of the great world weren't strong enough, but whoever it was who managed to put out such a compelling story without a doubt possessed great talent. By the time the story finally reached its conclusion, the mysterious girl could clearly be heard weeping. As it turned out, she was actually moved by the final plot of the story. And it should go without saying that she wasn't the only one who felt that way. Truth be told, a lot of creatures who had been paying close attention to the story felt so touched as well, but it was just that they didn't have a roaring token to cry their hearts out. Chapter 1172. Embark on true path once again. The audience in the universe reflected on the story that Zen told them. Of course, not all living creatures like to listen to such things. Many martial artists needed to cultivate in seclusion and not be disturbed at all. Once they had cultivated to a critical point, a single disturbance could cause their cultivation to go berserk. The sound of the roaring token was unstoppable in the entire universe. Whether it was deep underground or far into the sky, it could be heard without any obstructions. There was no way to resist it. The Supreme Lords had only a few roaring tokens. Normally, only one of them would be used in a day. Sometimes, they did not use it even once in 15 days. Even so, once it rang out, it was not a small risk to the martial artists undergoing a tribulation or breaking through their bottlenecks, for it could possibly jeopardize their tasks. But now, Zen had used the roaring token to tell a story, and he narrated it for several hours. It was torture enough for these martial artists. Some practitioners had even given up on their training. They became resentful of Zen. However, the lifetime worth of these martial artists might not be enough to purchase a roaring token. Even if they were angry, Zen would not be able to hear them. Not long after he finished telling his story, Zen heard a series of clanging sounds behind him. He turned to see Livingston rushing toward him speedily. In the blink of an eye, Livingston used his hands to grab onto Zen's arms and said in an excited tone, "Zen. What is it?" A strange expression appeared on Zen's face. I. Livingston continued to gesticulate frantically, unable to speak clearly. After a long while, he finally said, "Can you open that weapon refining workshop? Immortal book said that you could do it." To open the workshop, Zen had to embark on the true path once again. He could obtain a token immediately after passing a stage of the true path. Zen's current cultivation and strength had improved by quite a bit. He was confident that he would be able to take another step forward in the true path. Perhaps, he might even be able to take 2 steps forward. However, the tokens he obtained from roaming about the true path would be randomly distributed. In addition to the token required to open the weapon refining workshop, there were also tokens for the pill refining workshop, as well as the training tower. Zen could not guarantee for certain that he would get his hands on the one required for the weapon refining workshop. Therefore, he smiled faintly and said, "This time, as of return to the fairy palace, I will certainly try to overcome the true path once again. However, I can't guarantee you that I'll be able to open the weapon refining workshop." Clang. After hearing Zen's answer, Livingston fell to the ground. Although one could not see any expressions on his face, one could tell from his action that he had fallen into depression. "What's wrong? Have you learned a lot in the library?" Zen asked. Hearing Zen's question, Livingston got up abruptly and said enthusiastically, "Yes, quite a lot." "Oh my lord." His excitement was beyond words. As a weapon refiner of the last grand era, he was naturally a very conceited person, even to the point of madness. When he had first flipped through the books on weapon refining, he had been full of disapproval. The fairy palace was a magical place, but in Livingston's eyes, its owner was wasting a lot of resources in decorating the walls and the floors. The wastefulness of it all was outrageous. However, once he started reading through the books in detail, he was immediately immersed and unable to extricate himself from it. Livingston was a very intelligent person as well. With respect to weapon refining, he had put forward many bold ideas. But just because he had put them forward did not mean that he could realize them. As he skimmed through the pages, he realized that many of his ideas already existed. Not only had the ancestors completed his ideas, but they had also improved on them. After all, these ancient books and legacies came from beyond the universe, from above the heavens. Once Livingston had finished reading, he felt almost dizzy. The shock in his heart had almost caused him to be unable to stand steadily. It was also because of this that his interest in the weapon refining workshop had grown even more. However, he was unable to enter the workshop and could do nothing about it. Just at that moment, Immortal book had reminded Livingston that Zen could open the weapon refining workshop. Upon hearing this, he naturally became ecstatic and ran over, begging Zen to open the workshop by any means, no matter what. Zen did not reject his plea. Back then, he had in fact brought Livingston into the fairy palace in order to put him in charge of the weapon refining workshop. Zen had already passed 2 stages of the true path and had broken through to the Soul Sea realm. It was time to enter again. It was just that he could not guarantee what kind of token he would get. After making some preparations, Saul led the way for them. Zen, Freya, and Livingston followed closely behind. Naturally, Lavender floated by Zen's side as they passed through the great halls of the fairy palace and headed straight for the true path. Previously, Zen had embarked on the true path in the lower world. At that time, he had relied on power transfer to transmit the power of his opponent to any corner of the great world. It was also because of this ability that he had been able to pass the first 2 stages of the true path in one go. As of now, Zen had already ascended to the upper world. His connection with the great world was already weak. Now, he could only rely on himself. However, his strength was no longer what it used to be. After his cultivation improved, his strength had also greatly increased. Facing the vast fog, he did not hesitate to step into the true path. Zen already had 4 tokens in his possession. They were the wind token for entering the fairy palace, the thunder token to open the true path, the mountain token to bring the fairy palace along, and the water token to access the library. Since these were tokens corresponding to the 8 diagrams, there should still be 4 more tokens in true path, namely the fire token for opening the weapon refining workshop, the valley token for opening the pill refining workshop, the earth token for opening the training tower, as well as the heaven token. Which token he obtained was a matter of pure luck. Saul had once said that there was a probability of obtaining a token he already possessed, something that would be unfortunate. Huff, huff. As Zen slowly moved forward, the surrounding scenery gradually changed. The dark and light energies once again appeared and entangled with each other, forming numerous human figures. The sacred race was a race with golden bloodlines, just like the celestial position. Zen was still unclear as to the relationship between the two, but the sacred race was indeed a perfect race. These figures materialized one by one into sacred martial artists and charged straight toward Zen. Whoosh! Zen held the Thunderwind divine sword in his hand, his eyes flashing with a dazzling light. The chaotic sea in his body surged along waves, while the power in his body began to rush forward like the tides. During the times he had been chased, he had relied on the reincarnation plate, lavender, and the fairy palace. As for Zen himself, he had not contributed too much. His cultivation was still too low, so he needed to train more. Kill. As he slowly brandished his sword, dozens of nether god shadows escaped from it. They went in different directions to encounter the sacred martial artists. PFF'd, PFFT, PFFT. As the nether god shadows closed in on the sacred martial artists, they easily tore their opponents to shreds, quickly turning them into dark and light energies. Zen was aware that it would not be difficult for him at the beginning of the 3rd stage of the true path. Just the nether god shadows themselves were enough to tear apart the sacred martial artists. He maintained his speed and continued forward. However, after about 5 minutes, the strength of the sacred martial practitioners formed by the dark and light energies seemed to increase. Almost all of the martial artists who appeared before him were at the late stage of the Soul Sea realm. Elites from sacred race. Zen's gaze darkened as he stared at them. These warriors from sacred race were clad in golden armors, with exquisite patterns carved onto them. They held all kinds of divine weapons in their hands. It was obvious that they were unlike the sacred warriors whom he had encountered before. The punches of the nether god shadows were far less effective than those of the elites. The elites easily cleaved the nether god shadows into pieces and then circled round Zen. Facing the first sacred elite, who rushed at him, Zen wielded the Thunderwind divine sword in his hand. Clang! A crisp sound rang out. Zen's face revealed some surprise. His sword attack had been blocked by a sacred elite, who was using a halberd. Zen snorted dismissively and turned his sword in a soft motion. His weapon flashed like lightning as it went around the elite's neck. When a spurt of golden blood squirted out, Zen's figure was already 1,000 feet away. Chapter 1173, Gus. Zen's silhouette flew through the air, his sword light like wheels of light. Although these sacred elite warriors had their own consciousness and techniques, Zen was able to easily kill them without much effort. Within 5 minutes, he had traveled nearly half the distance on the true path. Freya, Livingston, Lavender, and Saul stood at the starting point of the true path in silence as they watched Zen fight. Zen's cultivation speed is not slow. 2 years ago, he was only at the 1st grade of life and death realm, Saul commented. In truth, Zen had not relied on his own strength to pass the 2nd stage of the true path 2 years ago. Freya glanced at Saul furtively. In 2 years, Zen had crossed a great realm. Yet Saul's only conclusion was that Zen's cultivation speed was not slow. In her eyes, his cultivation speed was pretty unbelievable. Back then, she had expended a country's resources in order to break through that realm. Lavender nodded in approval. It is indeed not slow, but it is still not enough. Isn't the illusion battlefield about to open? Before Zen enters the battlefield, his strength will need to increase even more. As for Livingston, he stood frozen as he watched Zen. He did not care whether or not Zen had improved or how much he must improve further. He only cared for the weapon refining workshop in the fairy palace. In just a few moments, each of the sacred elite warriors had been eliminated by Zen. Strangely, the dark and light energies on the true path did not condense again. Zen was the only one running on the path. How is the 3rd stage so easy to pass? A look of doubt passed Zen's face. Zen naturally would not miss the chance to pass through the true path. Since there was no resistance, his speed increased a bit. However, the situation did not last for long. After a while, the dark and light energies slowly began to circulate and gather once again. This time, they gathered at a single point. Ever so slowly, they morphed into a person. Who is it? Who's there? A grave look marred Zen's features as he took in the human figure. There was no way that such a flaw would appear on the true path. This person must indeed be strong. Not long after, the human form became more and more distinct. It was a young man dressed in cotton clothes. His hands and feet were bare, and he did not hold any weapons in his hands. A warrior at the early stage of Soul Sea Realm. Zen was puzzled as he sized up his opponent. The cultivation level of this young man was almost the same as his. Previously, the elite warriors from the sacred race he had encountered had all been at the Soul Sea Realm. Some of them had even been at the later stage of the Soul Sea Realm. But now, a warrior at the early stage of the Soul Sea Realm had materialized before him. This left Zen rather confused. As the young man's figure was outlined and became more visible, his face revealed a strange smile. The next instant, he began to run ahead with all his might. Whoosh! He ran on the side of the true path, sprinting forward as he closed in on Zen. He was, in fact, quicker than Zen. So fast, Zen was slightly shocked, but the power of his grip on the Thunderwind Divine Sword only increased. When the young man got near enough, Zen would waste no time in killing him. 100 feet, 50 feet, 30 feet, Nether God Shadows. When the young man was less than 30 feet away, Zen's Thunderwind Divine Sword vibrated lightly and 7 Nether God Shadows leapt out. They shot toward the young man swiftly. Ha ha! A soft laugh escaped the young man's lips. He suddenly jumped up and turned his body. For some unknown reason, Zen felt his vision blur as the man easily avoided the 7 Nether God Shadows. What is this movement technique? It is so odd. A light passed through Zen's eyes as the Thunderwind Divine Sword slashed down at the young man's head. At this moment, the young man uttered, "Wait. No hurry." As he said this, he stretched his fingers and lightly flicked Zen's sword. Buzz! With such a light flick, his strength should not have been great. However, the sword in Zen's hand began to vibrate heavily, almost making him unable to maintain his grip. As the power of the dragon scale surged through him, Zen forcefully suppressed the vibrations of the Thunderwind Divine Sword. He took a few steps back and pointed the tip of the sword downward. A vigilant expression came over Zen's features. When the young man saw Zen's reaction and his suppression of the vibrations of the sword, he was a bit surprised. A smile appeared on his face as he said to Zen, "Are you the new owner of the fairy palace?" Zen did not answer his question, but asked instead, "Who are you?" The man before him had also materialized from the dark and light energies. However, he seemed to be more special. Not only was his strength extraordinary, but he seemed eager to talk to Zen. "Me, ha," the young man laughed. However, at this time, Saul cut in, "Gus, he is Zen, your junior fellow disciple." Hearing Saul's words, Zen was utterly shocked. So Master has taken in more than just one disciple. This man in front of me is also his disciple. He is my senior fellow disciple. The smile that the man named Gus sported only grew wider. He looked at Zen more closely. Back then I left this soul fragment here. Now it seems I had made the right move. I didn't expect Master to end up taking in another disciple. As Gus spoke, he seemed to realize something. Wait, he said suddenly. If Master was willing to accept you as a disciple, does that mean you have cultivated the primal chaos technique? He looked Zen up and down with disbelief in his eyes. For countless years, the master of the fairy palace had only accepted 2 disciples. He had divided the cultivation methods of his lifetime into 2 sections and passed on to each of the 2 disciples a section. Gus was Zen's second senior fellow disciple. Gus remembered that his master had once said that he would not take in a disciple again, unless the person's physique was suitable to practice the primal chaos technique. His master always kept his word. Since Zen had become Gus's master's 3rd disciple, he must have mastered the primal chaos technique. Zen stared at Gus, deep in thought. His expression was indifferent, but in his heart, he weighed the strength of the man before him. With Zen's current strength, it would be difficult for him to find a suitable opponent at the Soul Sea realm. However, this man made him feel a faint sense of danger. "Answer me, Zen, have you truly cultivated the primal chaos technique?" A smirk still adorned Gus's lips as his gaze almost pierced through Zen. "I have no need to tell you that," Zen said indifferently. Gus crossed his arms over his chest, seemingly amused. He chuckled as he ambled toward Zen. "Interesting. You seem to be very arrogant. My body might only have been formed through the dark and light energies, and I might only be at the soul sea realm, but I think you will find yourself unable to pass through me. If you show me some respect and just answer my question, I will let you pass unharmed. As he spoke, he got closer and closer, now only a few feet away from Zen. That sounds like a good idea. Zen smiled, but I don't want to do that. As he spoke, Zen's sword light flashed, a chilling blue light leaking from the Thunderwind Divine Sword, straight toward Gus's head. Whoosh, ding, Gus's feet were as if nailed to the ground, and his body did not move at all. Instead, he leaned to the side. He tapped at the Thunderwind Divine Sword slightly, and it began to violently tremble once again and left Zen's hand. Zen seemed to have expected this move. He did not pursue his sword. Instead, with the power of over 10,000 dragon scales that had poured themselves into his two fists, he threw two punches at Gus with all his might. Hey now, Zen, get this right, I am from the sacred race. The difference in power between you and me is... Bam! Gus did not take Zen's attack seriously. He chuckled, about to be at the receiving end of both of Zen's fists. He merely swung one hand out. It was not that Gus looked down upon Zen. The sacred race had originally been a perfect race. It was the origin of all primates. Humans had been born out of the sacred race and had inherited some of their strength. However, Gus did not expect the formidable power stored in Zen's fists. After all, Zen was only at the Soul Sea realm. Before Gus knew it, he was sent flying backward by Zen's fists. He didn't drop to the ground until he had flown thousands of feet in the air. Chapter 1174, God's Intimidating Strike. Puff! A mouthful of golden blood sprayed forth from Gus's mouth. The dark and light energies were very special, and the life form which they created was no different from a real one. Gus extended his hand to wipe away the golden blood from the corner of his mouth. A peculiar light flashed through his eyes as he looked at Zen with new respect. Master always has sharp instincts. You are a talented warrior, Gus commended him. He stood up, regaining his feet and checked his own status. However, to be able to be accepted by Master as a disciple, one has to be one in a million. Our eldest fellow disciple is a super talent too. But Zen, I don't think that you can possibly defeat me. I will give you one more chance. Give me a salute, and... Before he could finish speaking, Zen had already turned around. He controlled his sword which was not in his hand with his mind and made it fly towards Gus. Meanwhile, he himself was flying towards the finishing point of the true path. He was too bored by this senseless prattle to listen to this fellow. Seeing Zen's flying figure, Gus gnashed his teeth and chased after him in hot pursuit. Ever since he had become a disciple of his master, Gus had been constantly bullied by his eldest fellow disciple. Back then, his master had been in his prime years and had wanted to find a successor for his two outstanding cultivation methods. His master's first disciple had joined their sect only a few hundred years before Gus did. And because of the gap of a few hundred years, Gus had been bullied by him for countless more years, and he still hadn't been able to turn the tables, even now. If this went on, the possibility of him repaying the insults and tortures of the past would be very small in the future indeed. Now that he had finally found a junior fellow disciple, how could he let him go? If his original body came into being, he would naturally then be bullying the weak. With Gus's true strength, a single glance would have been enough to instantly kill Zen. However, this body formed by the dark and light energies had the same level of cultivation as Zen. This leveled the playing field. Don't run, Zen. Gus suddenly leapt into the air and his strange figure flashed into succession as he easily overtook Zen and appeared in front of him. Get out of the way. Zen similarly jumped up and circled around him. His sword also arrived at his side. Then, he grabbed onto it and suddenly thrust it at Gus. Zen's strength exploded out completely in the tremendous strike that followed. He was in a different situation than Gus. His only goal was to pass through the true path. If Gus wanted to provoke him, then Zen would kill him without hesitation. Gus looked at Zen's sword and a calm smile spread over his face. Although he was only at the early stage of the Soul Sea realm and was about the same level as Zen, the difference in experience between the two was far greater. This strike is not bad. Master doesn't use a sword, so you must have figured it out by yourself, right? Under this round of heavens, you're also considered one of the top talents. Seeing the sword slashing down directly at his head, Gus still did not dodge. Instead, both of his hands only moved slightly. This was the most commonly seen martial arts move. He faced the blade with empty hands. Ordinary warriors would be able to use this move if they were confident. But, in order to use this move, they had to know their own strength and grasp the exact direction of the sword. Gus also had to be extremely precise if he hoped to win. There could be no failure with this move, for failure meant death. If there was even the slightest unaccounted variable, his hands would be crippled. Moreover, Zen was already a warrior at the Soul Sea realm and Gus had already witnessed the terrifying strength that Zen had unleashed, but he still dared to fight empty-handed against Zen's sword. He was clearly supremely confident in his own strength. The blade of the 5-foot-long sword pierced through Gus's palms with tremendous force. The sword stabbed straight into his palms, but its speed instantly slowed. 1 inch, 5 inches, 9 inches, 12 inches. As the sword stabbed 12 inches into Gus's palms, it was forcibly caught within. As for the sword's tip, it finally stopped right in front of his chest with the tip gently pressing against the bare skin. Gus smiled. With your cultivation at the early stage of the Soul Sea realm, the power you can unleash is comparable to a Spirit Supreme Realm warrior. You are considered outstanding, but still far from enough in my eyes. Zen's gaze froze slightly. Aside from the Supreme Lords, the World Lords and the Spirit Supreme Realm warriors, Gus was indeed the strongest opponent he had ever met amongst his peers. In the Humanity Alliance, besides those Supreme Lord descendants, Layla had been considered his strongest opponent. However, Zen was still able to leave her far behind with his power and skills. That being said, Gus's current cultivation was also at the early stage of the Soul Sea realm, but he could snatch away Zen's sword with his bare hands. But the fight was unfair. Gus's true strength was hard to imagine. Even the Supreme Lords in the universe would not be able to compare to him. When he fought against Zen, he had suppressed his strength to the same level as Zen's. But whether it was combat experience, or the difference in their understanding of raw strength and laws, Zen was left feeling much inferior to Gus. Cut the garbage. Zen suddenly drew his sword, and with a resounding slash, he stabbed it vehemently towards Gus. Gus chuckled as he followed suit and seized the blade with his bare hands again. He gripped Zen's Thunderwind Divine Sword with both hands, and with a light rub between his left and right palms, the hilt suddenly spun rapidly from Zen's hands. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Gus approached Zen and his shoulder suddenly collided with him. Bam! The collision had unexpectedly sent Zen flying, while Gus also took a few steps back. An astonished expression once again appeared on Gus's face. What a tough body! Gus pinched his shoulder and let out a hissing sound. Then, with a light pinch, a crisp cracking sound was heard. The broken bone had been instantly reattached, such was Gus's power. Then, he threw the sword to stab into the ground in front of Zen, causing the blade to wiggle endlessly. At the same time, he laughed and said, "What is with your body? How could it be so strong?" However, Zen couldn't be bothered to talk to him. Zen had never suffered loss in a physical confrontation before, but he had just been sent flying by this warrior in their collision. The Sacred Race warriors were indeed strong. I had originally thought that no one in the same realm could defeat me. However, Gus's cultivation is only at the Soul Sea realm, yet he's actually able to suppress me in the aspect that I'm most adept at, Zen thought. Gus came to the same conclusion in his heart. The disciples that his master had accepted were indeed all extraordinary warriors. Zen didn't know, of course, that Gus had long since surpassed the heavens. He was a heaven-shaking figure and even beyond the heavens. Although he was impressed, he would not accept his fate. There was no such word in Zen's head as surrender. With a flip of his body, he pulled out his Thunderwind Divine Sword and once again charged towards Gus. Bam! The same move, the same method, the same result. Zen fell to the ground once again, and the Thunderwind Divine Sword again ended up quivering in the ground next to him. After Zen got up, Gus smiled and said, "Zen, you should accept your fate. You aren't even 30 years old, while I have lived for several grand eras. If I really was to be defeated by you, then I would truly be an idiot. No, even an idiot who has lived for several grand eras would be somebody." He stopped mid-sentence. At this moment, Zen's gaze suddenly turned incomparably cold. A faint sword intent was now attached to the Thunderwind Divine Sword. The god's intimidating strike was extremely powerful. When it was used by a Supreme Lord, it could even injure a true god. However, this was not the most terrifying part of the god's intimidating strike. In the history of the universe, countless talents had created many miraculous martial skills, some of which were extremely terrifying. Combined with the laws of causality of some Supreme Lords, they might not be weaker than the god's intimidating strike. However, either the cost to use these heaven-defying martial skills was enormous, or the time needed to prepare was extremely long. Either way, it was not a swift battle tactic. When warriors fought each other, the long period of preparation for a martial skill was also a major flaw. It could not be used to fend off an immediate attack. However, the god's intimidating strike was very special. It did not even require a brewing process, and it could be performed at will. That alone made it intimidating to not just the gods. When Zen entered the state of abandoning all of his emotions, his sword was suddenly thrust out. Do you still dare to take it head on? After he finished speaking, Zen's sword had already arrived in front of Gus. Gus had already seen that Zen's sword attack this time was extraordinary, but how could he willingly show his fear? He continued to extend his hands, intending to receive Zen's sword blow with the same force as before. The sword blade was again received by Gus. But at the same time that he caught Zen's sword, the powerful sword intent left the blade and continued to charge straight at him. God's intimidating strike. This sword strike could cut through the heavens, destroy tens of thousands of laws, and even exterminate a true god. It was unstoppable. It was true that Zen had displayed such terrifying power, as he had already comprehended 99% of this sword technique. How many people at the same level could contend against him? Chapter 1175. Emotion Closing Godly Way. At this moment, the power contained within the sword intent caused Gus's expression to change drastically. Stunned, he cried out inwardly. Almost in an instant, he let go of the sword in his hand and leaned backward, trying to avoid the daunting sword intent. But when Zen truly launched the power of the god's intimidating strike, even Zen himself would not be able to control the strong power it contained. The piercing sword intent went straight for Gus and impaled his chest. It pierced through his chest, as if it had not encountered any physical resistance whatsoever. The sword intent escaped out of his back. Golden blood blossomed into golden flowers, morphing into the dark and light energies that gradually dissipated. You should have done that a long time ago. In the distance, Freya stared at this scene in front of her. The corner of her mouth slightly curled up and she let out a long sigh of relief. Regardless of the level of Zen's true strength, in Freya's heart, he was already invincible. Aside from the fact that Zen was unable to fight world lords and supreme lords, when had he ever suffered a loss while facing a soul sea realm or spirit supreme realm warrior? Freya's insight was naturally inferior to that of Lavender. It was even inferior to Livingston's. Livingston was indeed immersed in the path of weapon refining, but he had also been a powerful world lord back then. When Livingston and Lavender had seen Gus materialize, they realized that he exuded profound strength. Although he had only been at the Soul Sea realm, they felt that Zen was in trouble. But how could Freya feel that? She only saw that the young man was unarmed, yet he had snatched away Zen's sword 2 or 3 times in succession. Zen, meanwhile, had almost no strength to fight back. When she saw Zen continuously suffer setbacks, she had been incredibly nervous. She also hated Gus. He had known Zen was his junior fellow disciple, yet he attacked ruthlessly. Clearly, Gus was not a very righteous person. However, it was not long before she saw Zen unleash the astonishing sword attack, injuring Gus. Her heartbeat finally returned to normal. The smile on Gus's face had frozen. Even though he was only at the Soul Sea realm, his eyes were sharp. When Zen unleashed his sword intent, Gus realized that it was passed down in the emotion-closing godly way. The specialty of the emotion-closing godly way was decisive killing. The instant one executed a sword move, one could completely close off all his or her emotions. However, one usually had access to the edge of the emotion-closing godly way only after becoming a world lord. Even a supreme lord would not be able to display the full extent of the emotion-closing godly way, but the aura contained within Zen's sword strike seemed to have reflected that. Is this boy truly only at the Soul Sea realm? Gus suspected that Zen was a true god, reincarnated with the latter's memories and insights. Zen's eyes turned cold once again after the attack. No warmth seemed to exude from his body. At the same time, a wisp of sword intent constantly pulsated on the edge of the Thunder Wind Divine Sword, emitting a faint blue light. He did not give Gus the chance to recover. The god's intimidating strike contained a majestic aura, and it was already shooting at Gus. Stop, calm down, we can talk about this. Gus vigorously tapped the ground with his hand. His body flashed. The outline of his figure turned erratic right in front of Zen's eyes. Zen could not see him clearly anymore. Gus displayed his strange escaping technique in an attempt to dodge Zen's slash. A few drops of golden blood fell to the floor. In the next moment, Gus appeared beside Zen with a wry smile on his face. We can talk about this without fighting. Even before he finished speaking, Gus's expression changed once again. Zen let out a short huff. His eyes still flickered with a cold light as the Thunderwind Divine Sword slashed a circular sword light in the air. It was the god's intimidating strike. It was still incomparably fast and still possessed a terrifying might. Gus's movements were still strange as he tried to deploy his technique. He barely managed to dodge the attack. The god's intimidating strike could be called one of the most powerful sword skills in the universe. Whether it was speed or power, it reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship in both aspects. If Gus himself had personally come and stood there while Zen slashed tens of thousands of times with his sword, he would not have lost anything. However, the Gus before him was only at the Soul Sea realm. Dodging Zen's attack was quite an arduous task. Puff! Another golden flower of blood bloomed on Gus's leg. The wound was so deep that the bone was visible. I have something important to tell you. Can you stop? Let's have a good talk first. Gus's features were anxious, but his words had no effect on Zen. Right now, Zen had already entered the state of closing emotions. Although he could not block out all the emotions in his heart, he was anyway not the least bit interested in the nonsense Gus was spouting. Curse you, the primal chaos technique is awful. Seeing that Zen was still wielding the sword at him, Gus once again used his escape skill to avoid the god's intimidating strike. Zen's god's intimidating strike was indeed powerful, but it was not so impressive in Gus's eyes. What had him troubled was the primal chaos technique. The reason for it was simple. A sword move like the god's intimidating strike demanded a high amount of life vitality from a martial artist. The speed at which the life vitality was being consumed was much more. Warriors at the Soul Sea realm who cultivated the life vitality system could only use 2 strikes at most. Then they had to stop and replenish their life vitalities. However, this boy in front of him did not have the life vitality within his body. Rather, he was accumulating chaotic energy in his body. In his early years, Gus had heard from his master that the natures of the chaotic energy and the life vitality were similar. For instance, life vitality could be turned into something through visualization, but chaotic energy could directly be turned into something. Life vitality could form a world within the body and nurture life, while the chaotic energy was the very foundation of all life. It was also because of this conjecture that his master had written the primal chaos technique, and was quite proud of it. Chaotic energy was thousands of times thicker and more solid than life vitality, and once successfully cultivated, the sea of the chaotic energy that the body contained was multiple times more powerful than the sea of life vitality that it could cultivate. Later on, when his master had finished compiling the primal chaos technique, he mournfully commented that no one in the entire universe would be able to cultivate the primal chaos technique. He told Gus that if he met such a person in the future, he would undoubtedly take him in as his third disciple. Zen was able to unleash the god's intimidating strike, again and again without hesitation, while Gus did not even have time to speak. He only tried to flee in every direction. Slashes of sword intent continued to pierce through the true path, as if they were invisible blades slicing a number of cracks in the ground. Zen walked slowly, closing in on Gus step by step. With every thrust of his sword, the ground was covered with more golden blood. The wounds on Gus's body also increased in number. Saul, who was watching the battle, also looked surprised. As a high-level puppet, his appearance was no different from a human's. Therefore, he could show more expressions than ordinary puppets. I never thought that Gus would find it hard to tackle Zen, he said. Freya looked at Saul curiously, thought for a while, and said, wasn't it obvious? Zen has a weapon, but Gus, he is unarmed, and he is also just at the Soul Sea realm. She had originally wanted to point out that Gus was already coping well, being at the early stage of the Soul Sea realm. He was still able to fight Zen to this extent. However, right now she was inside the fairy palace, which she felt was extraordinary in itself and it intimidated her. She was too embarrassed to retort to Saul. Saul gave her a small smile and said, you don't understand. Gus possesses the bloodline of a king of the sacred race and is considered a top existence in the race. My master took him in as a disciple, so how could he be weak? You treat him as an ordinary warrior at the Soul Sea realm. Pa. The master that Saul was referring to was naturally Zen's master as well. Even though Lavender, Livingston, and Freya were not aware of Gus's origins, Saul knew of it all too well. As someone who had surpassed the heavens, Gus was now someone who could secure a place even in the world above the heavens. Even though he was only at the early stage of the Soul Sea realm now, in fact, he should still be much stronger than Zen. However, Saul was only expressing his feelings. If his master were to come to know of Zen's strength, he would be extremely pleased. As for the fight on the true path, Saul would naturally not stop it. Puff! Some more golden blood spurted out. By now, Zen had chopped up most of Gus's body into pieces. His body parts turned into dark and light energies and gradually diffused in the air. Only his head and upper body were left on the ground now. He could not dodge the attacks anymore. However, Zen's offense slowed down. He walked up to Gus and squatted down, saying, speak. Now we can have a good talk. Chapter 1176. The Endless Divine Land. Zen's goal now was to pass the third section of the true path. Gus had ambushed him in the third section. Although Zen believed that Gus was his master's second disciple, he did not hold back at all. Gus was too strong. If Zen gave him a chance, Zen might lose to him. Right now, Gus could no longer fight back, so it was a good time to have a talk, like he had suggested earlier. Seeing Zen's cunning smile, Gus rolled his eyes. "How could you treat me like this?" he asked in anger. He had been bullied by his master's first apprentice for a number of years. Now that he had met the third apprentice, he thought he would turn the situation around in his favor. To his chagrin, however, Zen fought him fiercely at their very first meeting. It disgusted Gus to no end. Zen's smile grew an inch wider. "Is this what you want to talk about?" He held the Thunderwind Divine Sword in his hand as he spoke, as if ready to cut Gus's head off at any moment. Of course not. Gus was unhappy to a great extent. Zen paused for some time and asked, "What exactly do you want to say?" "You know what, I did this for your own good. In any case, we have the same master," Gus said in despair. "If our senior fellow disciple comes to know about this, he may decide to punish me again." Zen continued to look indifferently at Gus, not saying a word. "You're a member of the Fairy Palace, but you've only cultivated the Primal Chaos technique. Your other cultivation methods don't originate from the library, correct?" Gus asked. Zen nodded slowly. He was not sure how Gus knew of it, but he had indeed not chosen to cultivate the other cultivation methods in the library. There were all kinds of martial arts in the library, even the transcendent divine might was commonly seen, but Zen believed that he was suited the best only to certain cultivation methods. In addition to the primal chaos technique, he had only read books on the original laws in the library. "Ah, what a waste. You have many treasures, but you don't make good use of them." Gus heaved a sigh, curling his lips in distaste. "Hey, your body is fast disappearing. Could you just get to the point?" Zen reminded him. The dark and light energies had transformed into Gus's body. Now that he was severely injured, the part of the body above his chest was slowly dissipating back into dark and light energies. However, Gus himself did not care a bit. He continued, "This wisp of my soul isn't able to tell your fortune. But as my master's disciple, if you can't even cross the heavens, it's a joke. To be honest, if you merely rely on the emotion-closing godly way, you will find it unimaginably hard to cross the heavens. Since our master is not here, I will guide you on his behalf." "Your neck is about to disappear too," Zen reminded him expressionlessly. Most of Gus's body had disappeared. Even his neck was slowly diffusing away, turning into dark and light energies. "I know," Gus screamed with contempt. "I don't need you to remind me." "Then don't talk such a load of garbage," Zen said. Quote. Gus stared at Zen, clenching his teeth in bitter hatred. "A long time ago," he said, "I heard our master mention that if the primal chaos technique was combined with other cultivation methods, it would have fundamental changes. Now that our master is not here, I can recommend you a few cultivation methods on his behalf, and you can cultivate them in the Fairy Palace. They are the enemy repelling arts, the Thunderbolt Annihilation, and the 8 Smoky Melodies." "Do they belong to the Transcendent Divine Might?" Zen asked. Gus's face revealed a hint of disdain. "Transcendent Divine Might? Come on, only those in the universe dare to claim their martial arts to be transcendent." "Ha, I don't know whether or not they belong to Transcendent Divine Might, but I should tell you that I was able to dominate the universe and cross the heavens once I mastered them years ago. And although you're not as strong as me, you're not weak either." As he finished, his entire head began to disappear, turning into energies. However, just as he dissipated, a speck of light appeared from the dark and light energies and circled Zen once before a ray of consciousness penetrated into his mind. "Work hard. I'll wait for you. When you meet me, I'll tell you more. Ha ha." Following this, the speck of light began to rapidly rise higher and higher until it reached the pink enchanted barrier at the top of the Fairy Palace. It crept outside and completely disappeared. In the endless divine land above the heavens. Within the dense fog were many glittering, richly ornamented buildings. A cyan ox knelt on the top of one of the buildings. On the back of the ox sat a boy, holding a flute to his mouth as he played it softly. Not long after, someone jumped toward the building, waving at the boy. "Brother, brother." The figure leapt and landed on the top of the building, where the boy was. Boom! A loud sound rang out and some tiles on the roof were shattered to pieces. "Moo!" The cyan ox, frightened by the sound, protested in dissatisfaction. The boy put down the flute in his hand and stared at the intruder unkindly. What is it that makes you so flustered? He asked in a chilly tone. Brother, did you know that our master has accepted a third disciple? The man smiled as he asked the question. The boy was surprised at his words. A third disciple, you mean, our master found a suitable person to cultivate the primal chaos technique? Yes, but the boy is only at the soul sea realm. He's still struggling under the heavens. The person speaking was Gus. As a matter of fact, Gus was only his nickname. His full name was Augustus Yu. In the endless divine land, he was a well-known figure. A soul sea realm boy. The boy looked to be deep in contemplation. He put the flute to his waist, stretched out his fingers, and gently pinched them together. A mysterious halo of light spread out on his palm. Even a supreme lord could not arbitrarily tell the fortune of someone in the universe. The only way to tell it was if the person whose fortune was to be told stood in front of the fortune teller. Back then, the specific location of the crown of destiny had been estimated accurately because it was scarce and there were few variables. Yet, the boy was trying to see Zen's fortune. After the faint halo of light came to being, it slowly rose up. The boy constantly moved his fingers. After a while, his face betrayed his confusion. He could not see anything. As the halo completely disappeared, the boy waved his hand again and another halo of light spread out. He continued to try to tell Zen's fortune. Why? The boy was taken aback. The martial artist seems to be a man without destiny. I can't tell his fortune. A man without destiny. Gus was surprised as well. There is nothing under the heavens that I cannot know, except those without destiny. That is the only explanation to this. The boy frowned as he stared at his fingers. He glared at Gus and continued, you have cultivated the special vision technique and a wisp of your soul fragment alone can tell the fortunes of others. Since you met him in the fairy palace, why didn't you tell his fortune? Well, an innocent expression appeared on Gus's face. Brother, I have recommended 3 cultivation methods to him. That's not enough. What a good for nothing. The boy gently patted the cyan ox and it struggled a few times before standing on its feet. I am leaving. As he finished speaking, the cyan ox lifted its 4 hooves and soared into the sky. Just then, Gus remembered something. He smacked his head. Brother, there's one more thing. As far as I know, our little brother cultivates the emotion-closing godly way. The emotion-closing godly way? The boy turned around with a thoughtful expression on his face. Isn't he only at the soul sea realm? Gus shrugged. I too find it strange. He has mastered much of the emotion-closing godly way. When my soul fragment transformed into a soul sea realm warrior, it was killed by his sword intent. You are truly useless. Saying this dismissive statement, the boy swiftly left with his ox. Gus was visibly upset as he watched his brother leave. He sat down on the top of the building, looking sulky. Over the years, he had always been looked down upon by his senior fellow disciple. By now he was accustomed to it. However, a faint smile soon emerged on his face. If Zen could cross the heavens in the future, he would have a little brother to bully too. Chapter 1177, The Weapon Refining Workshop. Zen was running at top speed along the true path. The second half of the third section of the true path had been secretly changed by Gus. He himself was the only test. Now that Zen had defeated Gus, the dark and light energies no longer condensed, and there was no longer any resistance. Therefore, Zen passed through the rest of the path with ease. Not long after, Freya, Livingston, and the others appeared in front of Zen. After he passed through the true path, a white light flashed in the sky as the dense fog dissipated. Then, it slowly descended. It was a token of the fairy palace. Everyone's gazes, including Zen's, were focused on the token. Livingston screamed out, a token? Is this the token used for opening the weapon refining workshop? When it came to this adventure along the true path, Livingston was the one who cared the most about the result. Saul said in his usual emotionless voice, except the tokens of heaven and earth, it could be any of the other 6 tokens. Weapon refining needs fire, so the token of fire is related to the weapon refining workshop. It's only a 1 in 6 chance. A 1 in 6 chance, exclaimed Livingston, shaking his metallic head. This probability was neither high nor low, and it immediately made him feel excited. The corners of Zen's lips curved up slightly. To him, anything was fine as long as the tokens didn't repeat themselves. As the token slowly descended, Zen reached his hand out to grab it and flipped it over. What token is it? Livingston waved his sharp claws, looking extremely excited. Zen gently waved his hand and, with a smile, showed the token to Livingston. On the front of the token, the word, fire, was impressively carved in large letters. Livingston tossed his head back in a howl of berserk laughter. It really is the token of fire. Luck is on my side. The heavens have given me what I want. Freya, Lavender, and even Saul couldn't help but roll their eyes at Livingston. The fairy palace was a place that surpassed the heavens. The things above the heavens had nothing to do with Livingston's luck. If anything, this was Zen's luck. After obtaining the token of fire, the group walked back to the main courtyard of the fairy palace and followed the path in the pavilion. As Zen activated the token in his hand, the door to the weapon refining workshop opened. Zen was the first to enter, and Livingston, who could hardly wait, followed right behind him. After entering the workshop, Zen looked around in surprise. There were all sorts of materials placed around the workshop, layer upon layer. These materials. Not far away, Zen saw a pile of wood. These pieces of wood had been cut into 1-inch thick blocks and were piled up like mountains. What was strange were the rings on the pieces of wood that looked like strange ghost heads. Zen was not proficient in weapon refining. Although he sensed a special kind of power from the wood, he had no idea what kind of wood this was. And it wasn't just him. Freya didn't know either. Even Lavender, who was much more knowledgeable than Zen and Freya, was at a loss. Zen wanted to grab a piece of wood casually, but before he could touch it, he heard a sharp cry from Livingston. Stop! Clank! Clank! After the scream, Livingston quickly squeezed his way to Zen's side, stretched out his claws, and said with a trembling voice, This is primeval death spirit wood. At first, Livingston didn't know what kind of wood this was either. But in this short period of time, he had read all the books about weapon refining in the library, and he had come across records of primeval death spirit wood. What is primeval death spirit wood? Zen asked. In a shaky voice, Livingston answered, the tree has no bark or leaves. All it has is a bare trunk. How does it grow without bark or leaves? Freya asked curiously. Livingston laughed, and then excitedly explained, I just learned about the primeval death spirit wood from the books in the library. I thought it only existed in legends, but surprisingly, it actually exists in real life. The tree grows because of the countless dead people that are buried beneath it. Although it doesn't have bark or leaves, it has stems that can absorb the nutrients from corpses. It grows very slowly. For example, it will take at least 300 million years to grow from the seedling stage to the wood we see. It needs to absorb trillions of dead souls to stay alive. My word, there really is such a tree. The difficulty of cultivating primeval death spirit wood was beyond imagination. It wasn't just because it grew slowly. It was actually a very fragile tree that could only survive by absorbing dead souls. That meant that corpses had to be constantly buried under it. If it needed only hundreds of years to grow, it would not be a big problem. Some large clans and sacred places could bury the corpses of their martial artists under the tree, so that it could absorb their souls. However, the tree needed hundreds of millions of years to grow. What did hundreds of millions of years mean? It was equivalent to the lifespan of a supreme lord. Moreover, during these hundreds of millions of years, nothing could go wrong. If the smallest thing went wrong, the tree would wither and die. The difficulty of nurturing the wood was evident. That was why when, a while ago, Livingston had found the records of primeval death spirit wood in the books on weapon refining, he hadn't taken it seriously. He had thought that such a thing simply did not exist in the world. Even a supreme lord would not be able to cultivate such wood, because if the slightest mistake was made during the hundreds of millions of years, then the tree would be lost altogether. But now, a pile of primeval death spirit wood had appeared in front of Livingston. He was so excited that he almost couldn't believe his own eyes. Seeing the indifferent expressions of Zen and the others, Livingston could barely wait to tell them about the history of the primeval death spirit wood. But what is it used for? After Zen heard what Livingston said, he looked curiously at the wood. It was indeed something of great origin. The existence of something that needed so much care over hundreds of millions of years seemed almost impossible. Livingston laughed and said proudly, the primeval death spirit wood can produce the mixed element flame, which is one of the most perfect flames. The most perfect flame? Zen's eyes flashed. Livingston began to show off his knowledge. He knew much more about the materials for weapon refining than the others present. Moreover, he had broadened his horizons in the library. After he read so many weapon refining books, his knowledge had expanded by more than 10 times. Yes, it's one of the 3 most perfect flames. By perfect, I mean that they are the most suitable for weapon refining. Other than the mixed element flame, there are 2 other perfect flames. One is the Sun Spring Essence flame, and the other is the Divine Flame. These 2 types of perfect flames are not easily obtainable. It is said that the Sun Spring Essence flame exists exclusively in the Sun Spring. As for the Divine Flame, it is said that it is born within the Divine Flame cauldron. At first, Zen had no interest in Livingston's answer. However, when Livingston mentioned the divine flame cauldron, Zen's eyes suddenly flashed. It turned out that the black flame within the divine flame cauldron was the divine flame, one of the three perfect flames. Livingston, however, didn't notice the change in Zen's expression and continued to impart his knowledge to the others even though he himself had only learned these things a while ago. While he was speaking, his eyes fell on a nearby weapon refining furnace. Bang! Livingston casually threw away the primeval death spirit wood in his hand and rushed toward the furnace, which was placed in a corner of the workshop. It had a very unique shape. The bottom was thin and the top was thick. It looked like a large wine pot, with the mouth missing. Livingston threw himself at the furnace and opened the door at the side of the furnace. Soon, a rainbow-colored light shot out from within. Surprisingly, the furnace was still burning, and there was a red-hot sword embryo lying inside. Obviously, the sword embryo had been burned for hundreds of millions of years in the furnace. Chapter 1178, Star Essence Iron. The sword embryo was a piece of the star essence iron that had been forged before. As soon as Livingston's eyes landed on it, they were glued to it. The sword embryo was not a refined one. It had been absorbing the flames from the furnace for many years, so it exuded a rainbow-colored light. The craft of weapon refining was very complicated. The process involved lots of steps, and refining a high-grade weapon needed more operations. The higher the grade of the weapon, the more intricate the process of refining it. The most crucial step of refining a weapon was smelting the metal. Many unimaginable materials existed in this world, such as the star essence iron, which was derived from a star known as the dark star. The dark star was very small and it could not shine, so it was tough to locate it. Every substance made out of the dark star was surprisingly heavy. Even a piece of it the size of a fingertip could weigh as much as 100,000 mountains. Undoubtedly, the star essence iron weighed a lot more. It was almost indestructible. Even if someone was to obtain a piece of the star essence iron, it would be difficult to preserve it. After all, it was too heavy. Once upon a time, a peerless master had taken a piece of the star essence iron from the bare dark star, but he had no way of keeping it. When this piece fell to the ground, it directly penetrated into the earth, forming a small but bottomless hole. Storing the star essence iron was indeed asking for trouble. Once, someone had tried to place it into the Sumeru space, but the weight of it instantly broke through and smashed the space. However, such a problem could not defeat humans. The warriors of this universe were brave in the face of all difficulties and tried to figure out the solutions to them with their endless efforts. It had happened that once, someone used a weaker material to create a bracket and then placed the star essence iron on the top of the bracket. 300,000 giant logs were then used to build up a huge chassis under the bracket to support the iron's weight, with 8 million divine textures placed around it as well. The bracket finally succeeded in holding the star essence iron. The 8 million divine textures were simultaneously activated and supported the huge chassis as well as the bracket to hold the star essence iron. Before this activation, when the piece of star essence iron was placed onto the bracket, the entire chassis sunk thousands of feet deep into the ground due to the massive weight, forming a huge crater. It was only after activating the 8 million divine textures and forming a powerful floating force that the chassis finally stopped sinking down and was able to support the piece of the star essence iron. But the 8 million divine textures consumed life vitality jades at every moment. Keeping this piece of the star essence iron in the supreme world required tens of thousands of life vitality jades a day. It was a massive expense for a year. The piece of the star essence iron before them, however, was laid casually in the middle of the furnace. The furnace, obviously, had to take the mass weight of the star essence iron. So did the ground beneath the furnace. Livingston circled the furnace a few times, and then told the others about the origin of the star essence iron. Zen, Freya, and Lavender were all petrified by it. Only Saul looked calm. Saul had come across such things too many times by now, so he was not caught by surprise anymore. Zen, as the current owner of this fairy palace, could not express his astonishment. It would be mortifying for him to reveal his ignorance in this aspect. That explains it. Zen finally realized something. The star essence iron could be kept here easily like other ordinary items, which meant that the structure of the fairy palace was distinctly tough. No wonder that when the group of supreme lords had been attacking on the outside for so long, the enormous fairy palace never shook once. As Livingston finished talking about the origin of the star essence iron, his brows knitted together, the expression on his face betraying the bitterness he felt in his heart. I can see that this sword embryo has been here for countless years. With its weight, it's impossible to process it with my current abilities. Forget forging it, I won't be able to move it at all. Even the smallest piece of the star essence iron was incredibly heavy. This sword embryo, however, was 4 feet long. A supreme world would find it hard to take on such mass weight. Listening to what Livingston said, Zen agreed with him. At the same time, he smiled and said, "Even if you possess the ability to process it into a sword, I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to lift it." When Saul heard their conversation, he walked to a corner of the weapon refining workshop and took out a light cyan pair of pincers. It was a common pair of pincers, but since it had been placed in here, it was obviously special. If made to touch the burning flames of the furnace, an ordinary pair of metal pincers would melt down instantly. However, Saul placed the pair of pincers into the furnace and firmly gripped the sword embryo with it and smiled, "You both can try." Hearing this, Livingston reached out with his sharp claws at once. He had created this body for himself for the sake of weapon refining. The claws were just about perfect to grab onto the end of the pair of pincers. Livingston hoped to lift it up. What happened next did not come as a surprise. The sword embryo did not move at all. It was as if it was embedded into the furnace. Obviously, it was not truly embedded in it. This just meant that the sword embryo was heavy beyond measure. According to Livingston, a piece of the star essence iron the size of a fingertip could weigh as much as 100,000 mountains. Compared to that, the sword embryo before them must weigh tens of millions of mountains. Or even more, if one were to calculate the weight. If anyone could pick up this sword embryo, he or she would have enough strength to lift up a great world. Livingston withdrew his claws and stepped aside. Zen immediately took the pair of pincers from Livingston and looked at the 4 feet long sword embryo. He used the pair of pincers to grab it. As his eyes narrowed, the dragon scales in his body was activated and their power started to surge toward his arms. At this moment, Zen experienced renewed strength. The muscles in his body seemed to inflate. The faint sound of growing bones could be heard. Still not moving, Freya neared him and stared at the sword embryo, gently shaking her head. No matter how strong Zen was, he could not lift up a great world. So how could he move the sword embryo? In the end, Zen had no choice but to release his grip. A helpless smile surfaced on his face and he gave the pair of pincers to Saul. Saul returned the pair of pincers to its original place. But when he got back to the furnace, he held another pair of pincers in his hand. It was a black pair of pincers with carved lines on its surface. Is this pair of pincers made out of wood? Curiosity was all over Zen's features. Many people knew that fire and wood neutralized each other. A metal pair of pincers would melt in these rainbow-colored flames. Would this wooden pair of pincers not burn in an instant? "Master, you can try first," Saul said with a smile. Zen nodded quietly. He reached to take the pair of pincers and was dumbstruck when he held it. This pair of pincers. It's weightless. Everything in this world had weight. Even the air had weight. The clouds floating in the sky turned into water upon condensing. The weight of the water was then equal to the weight of the clouds. Similarly, although paper and feathers were all very light, they still had a certain amount of weight. However, the pair of pincers in Zen's hand was actually weightless. He did not feel as if he was holding something light in his hands. It was like he was not holding anything at all. The pair of pincers was entirely without weight. Saul laughed. "Master, you can try to lift the embryo with this pair of pincers." Zen was curious as he looked at the pair of pincers. Since Saul had requested him to try to lift the sword embryo with it, he stuck the pair of pincers into the furnace with some hesitation. It then clamped onto the sword embryo. As it did so, a strange sensation spread through Zen's hands. At this moment, it was as if the sword embryo had lost its weight as well. With a gentle lift of the pair of pincers, the sword embryo lifted like it was a feather. Zen quickly pulled it out of the furnace. The sword embryo, glinting with rainbow-colored light, had not been refined. It had a coarse surface and looked nothing special. It was no doubt that the sword embryo could be processed and forged into a peerless divine weapon. Chapter 1179, The Beginning of the Illusion Battlefield. 2 strange rays of light shot out of Livingston's iron head. They glowed with vigor. Even though his puppet body was simple and crude, it was still able to express his emotions. The radiance clearly indicated that he was excited. How is this possible?" he exclaimed with surprise. It was hard to believe that this large piece of star essence iron, which was unimaginably heavy, had been picked up by Zen so easily. It was something beyond Livingston's imagination. Zen swung the sword embryo in a circle and smiled at Livingston. "Do you also want to give it a try?" He then handed the pincers to Livingston. Livingston took the pincers from him and discovered that as he held them, he did not feel their weight at all. "What a miracle," he said. "This tool is extraordinary." He had high expectations of the weapon refining workshop and knew that the items here were all special, but still, this miraculous tool exceeded his expectations. He examined the pincers closely but could not find anything special in them. Livingston failed to understand how the heavy iron became weightless by the tool. This pair of pincers is made of the Infinity Stone, so theoretically, it should be able to lift anything, regardless of the weight it has, Saul explained in a flat tone. The heavenly destiny of infinity. Livingston shouted out a strange term at Saul's explanation. Saul gave him a surprised glance and asked curiously, "What's that?" "It's the heavenly destiny of the last grand era. It was contained in the crown of destiny which was obtained by Supreme Lord of Infinity," Livingston recalled. The so-called heavenly destiny of infinity was also a law of causality. After the Supreme Lord of Infinity grasped such a law of causality, he could lift anything, including the sun, the moon, and the stars. "Oh, that's impressive," Saul responded listlessly. He then turned to Zen. "Zen, my master, you don't have to worry about the weight of the sword. There should still be some infinity stones in this workshop. After the star essence iron is shaped into a sword, its hilt can be made out of the infinity stone. Then you can use the sword at will." Zen nodded in agreement. Judging from the materials alone, it would be nearly impossible for his opponents to destruct and damage this new sword of his. But how powerful it turned out to be would depend on Livingston's workmanship. "This is great." Livingston was wild with joy. He held the pincers in his hand and toyed with the sword embryo skillfully. Clang! He was so happy that he threw the iron upward and loosened the grip of the pincers at the same time. "Watch out!" Freya screamed. His outrageous action scared the life out of her. Although the sword embryo was only 4 inches long, it weighed more than 10 million mountains. If it were to fall on someone, they would be smashed into meat paste. What a careless puppet! However, the puppet in question, Livingston, was quite confident of his movements. He unhurriedly waited for the sword embryo to spin once in the air. Before it fell to the ground, he extended the pincers and caught it steadily. He had immersed himself in weapon refining for hundreds of millions of years. How was it possible for him to make stupid mistakes like that? After he put the sword embryo into the furnace, he turned to Saul and asked, "I can now handle the star essence iron with these pincers, but how am I to forge it?" Obviously, ordinary hammers could not be used to forge this rare material. However, Livingston also knew that since the sword embryo was found in the workshop, there would be a suitable tool for it here as well. "Please follow me." Saul smiled and led them into the storeroom of the workshop. Aside from the various tools in the storeroom, there were countless rare materials, all arranged in a neat manner. It felt like a great treasure house. Livingston was dazzled by what he saw. He jumped with joy. This workshop was like paradise to him. Both him and Zen were lucky to be able to utilize this place. However, it would still take him some time to make full use of this weapon refining workshop. The day he would forge the sword embryo was yet to be on his agenda, but ever since he had entered the workshop, he could not move a step away from it. As for Zen, he once again immersed himself in the library. Gus's embodiment of dark and light energies had been defeated by him. He had later recommended 3 martial arts books to him. They were Enemy Repelling Arts, Thunderbolt Annihilation and 8 Smoky Melodies. There were countless martial arts books in the library, but since Gus specifically recommended these 3 books to him, Zen decided to find them and read through them in detail. Whether or not he practiced them would depend on their suitability to him. Meanwhile, a number of world lords guarded the fairy palace outside. After the Supreme Lords left, several large races had sent out some of their world lords to spy on the fairy palace. These world lords maintained a certain distance from the palace. After all, even the Supreme Lords were unable to escape the desperate melee. If these world lords were caught in it, it would not be a good end for them. With them around, Zen had no other choice but to hide in his fairy palace and continue his cultivation. So it was that 1 month passed. Then the 2nd month. And then the 3rd. The fairy palace still continued to float through the deep space. The universe had restored its peace. During this time, many Supreme Lords chose to stay indoors. Although they could not snatch the crown of destiny from Zen's hands, they knew that 4 new crowns of destiny would appear now that 4 Supreme Lords had fallen. Obtaining a crown of destiny meant the advent of a new Supreme Lord in their race. All races in the universe were ready to fight for the crowns of destiny. Soon, the 6th month arrived. The Supreme Lords felt the heavens shake. The first crown of destiny had appeared. In the 7th month, the heavens shook again. The 2nd crown of destiny had manifested. In the 8th and the 9th months, the other 2 crowns of destiny arrived. For these 4 crowns of destiny, the demon knight race, the ogres, the human race, and many other races fought 4 intense battles, expending their formidable strength. The fight for the crowns of destiny involved high stakes. Only the Supreme Lords and the World Lords participated in the war. It had little influence on the warriors under the World Lord level. Even though the Supreme Lords fought tooth and nail for the crowns of destiny, not a single one of them was killed. 6 World Lords were the only sacrifice of the war. In any case, it was a near impossible task to kill a warrior who had become a World Lord and mastered the skill of spatial transference. It was proof of the desperate melee's powerful effect. 4 Supreme Lords had died at the same time because of it. One of the 3 big human forces, named Thoughtless Minds and led by Supreme Lord of Original Sin, obtained 2 crowns of destiny. The other 2 were taken by the Demon Knight race and the ogres respectively. However, Elena did not feel too happy about obtaining a crown of destiny. Since Gunter had died because of the desperate melee, the Demon Knight race still had the same number of Supreme Lords as before. It was the same with the ogres. As for the Thoughtless Minds, no Supreme Lords from their group had died previously. The newly obtained crowns of destiny undoubtedly enhanced their human force by a wide margin. The Thoughtless Minds had originally been the greatest force of the human race. They had controlled 4,000 Supreme Worlds. Its leader, the Supreme Lord of Original Sin, was one of the few top-ranked Supreme Lords in the universe, and his heavenly destiny contained an extremely powerful law of causality. After this particular war, 2 members of the Thoughtless Minds would become Supreme Lords. This fact was the cause of worry for the rest of the races and the other 2 big human forces, the Humanity Alliance and the Blessed Buddha Land. Zen, however, knew nothing of these events in the outside world. Since he could not leave the fairy palace, he decided to cultivate in seclusion. Time went by quickly. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. In the blink of an eye, 5 years had passed. To most warriors, 5 years were almost negligible compared to their long lives. Freya, for example, was much older than she looked. But for Zen, 5 years was already a sixth of his past life. In these 5 years, Zen experienced 3 big heavenly tribulations, while his cultivation base reached the middle stage of the Soul Sea realm. As for the seed of the World Tree, it grew inside Zen's Soul Sea of chaotic energy. A trunk also emerged from the surface of his Soul Sea. One day, the heavens suddenly shook again. This time, it was not because a crown of destiny had appeared. The 128 Supreme Lords were all alive, so no crowns of destiny were to appear. However, the creatures in the 100,000 Supreme Worlds around the universe paid close attention to it. They knew the illusion battlefield was about to begin. Chapter 1180, Margaret's Journey. Strictly speaking, the opening of the world of chaos in the universe was an imminent crisis. Before the danger arrived, the heavens had sensed it and let the great luck reach the remarkable and matchless talents in the universe. This meant that those talents had the fate to lead the world of chaos. Those who possessed good fortune would go on to become the great men and women of the era. Their luck was different from that of ordinary people. However, there was still a chance that the one with the fate to lead the world of chaos would die. With the advent of the world of chaos, those warriors destined to fight would compete with each other and strive to become the main characters of the world. It was said that such a person would lead the races to combat the great danger that was going to befall the universe. The opening of the illusion battlefield would enable the warriors to compete with each other. The most powerful talent of the Grand Era would then be selected during the battle. In these 5 years, besides cultivating, Zen had used the roaring token to tell stories. However, the mysterious young girl did not have enough time daily. She seemed to spend most of it sleeping and cultivating, waking up once or twice every other year. The first thing she did when she woke up was to force Zen to tell her stories. At this time, Zen too asked the mysterious girl for any information regarding Yan. The young girl told Zen that she had entrusted the search for Yan to others, but had not received any response yet. Even though Zen was disappointed, he was still willing to tell stories. He was unable to confirm anything at present, but the world above the heavens was still too ethereal to him. That mystifying world was something that even the 128 Supreme Lords knew nothing about. Perhaps only this mysterious young girl could help him find Yan. As the heavens shook, indicating the opening of the illusion battlefield, the mysterious young girl woke up once again. However, this time, she did not rush to ask Zen to tell her a story. Instead, she announced in a strange, cold voice, "The illusion battlefield has opened." This time, the battlefield would accept all Soul Sea Realm warriors of the universe. As the mysterious young girl finished speaking, all the stars spun speedily. Zen opened his eyes. He was sitting on the square of the fairy palace. The illusion battlefield is your opportunity to shine. If you were to obtain a good ranking in the battle, the world lords guarding outside would leave soon. Lavender spoke flatly as she glanced at the stars in the sky. I have tricked and killed the supreme lords of their races. Would they be willing to leave without avenging them? Would Elena let us off the hook as well? Zen asked. At this moment, he had no idea what the illusion battlefield was all about. Lavender smiled faintly. Elena, of course, is unwilling to let go of us. She will never abandon her desire to kill me. However, perhaps to appease her race members for a while, she would choose to give in. I see. Zen nodded. Not long after, the stars in the sky began to shine brighter and brighter. Thin light spots shot down unceasingly. The number of Soul Sea Realm warriors in the 100,000 Supreme Worlds was too high. Each light spot corresponded to a Soul Sea Realm warrior. Buzz. A circular light spot appeared in front of Zen. Without hesitation, he stepped into it and sat down. At the same time, a circular light spot appeared in front of Freya. Her face betrayed a hint of doubt as she considered if she should enter the light spot or not. Lavender glanced at Freya. Although Freya's talent was not great, she was still very intelligent. Among all the women around Zen, she was the only one Lavender did not despise. The illusion battlefield is, in fact, a giant illusion space, where there is no danger to life, Lavender told her. However, for warriors of the Soul Sea Realm like you, it is also an excellent cultivation opportunity that you must not miss. Illusion space. Freya had heard of the illusion space before. However, she had not been in the upper world for long. So far, she had never entered the illusion space. Upon hearing Lavender mention it in relation to the illusion battlefield, she was somewhat perplexed. However, Lavender did not want to explain further. Whether or not Freya was willing to enter the illusion battlefield was entirely her own decision. Freya hesitated for a moment. Since Lavender had pointed out that the illusion space was not dangerous, and seeing that Zen had already entered the battlefield, she chose to enter it as well. Countless light spots appeared around all Soul Sea Realm warriors. In the Purple Power world, this strange little world was not counted among the 100,000 Supreme Worlds. On the top of the Apeiron Tower, Margaret sat on a giant sword. Countless gigantic swords spiraled around her. She looked much more mature and less gentle than how she was a few years ago. Her incomparably beautiful face looked charming under the shine of the sword light. By now, her cultivation base had reached the Soul Sea Realm. With a slight wave of her hand, hundreds of thousands of swords surged forward at the same time. Soon after, they converged to form a unique sword array that surrounded her. At first glance, the sword formation was nothing extraordinary, but when Margaret stood up and casually waved her hands about, the aura of the sword array underwent a tremendous change. The sword array emitted a strong killing intent. As she controlled the sword array, a lonely expression surfaced on her face. She seemed a bit aloof. It had been 7 years since Margaret and Zen separated. All these years, she had missed Zen to pieces. She had also waited for the illusion battlefield to open. Her master had told her that when the illusion battlefield came upon them, Zen would be sure to step inside. That would be when they met each other. But when exactly would the illusion battlefield open? At the thought of this, Margaret, who was performing the sword array, got a bit morose. With a flip of her slender and delicate fingers, she made a posture. She tried to keep calm. The giant swords turned over at the same time, forming a flat barrier above the Apeiron Tower. These giant swords seemed to consider Margaret their queen. They subserviently submitted to her. Margaret crouched and hugged her knees. Once she started to miss Zen, it was difficult for her to stop thinking of him. Zen's clear and shadowy figure continuously flashed through her mind. At this moment, Elder Apeiron appeared behind Margaret. Master. Margaret did not turn back, but she could feel the movement behind her. With a benevolent look on her face, Elder Apeiron walked toward Margaret, asking, Margaret, what's wrong? Nothing. All these years, Margaret had firmly reinforced her warrior spirit and rarely complained. Sometimes she felt depressed, but she knew how to disguise her emotions. However, Elder Apeiron smiled. Are you thinking of Zen again? No, Margaret replied immediately. I believe you miss him very much. I have had such an experience before, so I understand your feelings, Elder Apeiron said kindly. Hearing these words, Margaret got even more upset. She sniffled a little and said, I miss him, but it is useless. I have no clue where he is. Elder Apeiron placed her withered hand on Margaret's shoulder. Zen might have already entered the illusion battlefield, she pointed out. Huh, surprised, Margaret raised her head and looked at Elder Apeiron. The illusion battlefield has been opened now. Yes, how exciting. It really opened. Margaret was so enthusiastic that she almost jumped up. She had been waiting for this day for a long time. Elder Apiran nodded with certainty. All Soul Sea Realm warriors can enter the illusion battlefield. You are in the purple power world, where the spots of light cannot shoot in. Once I take you out of the purple power world, you can enter the illusion battlefield as well. Are you sure Zen can enter the illusion battlefield too? Margaret was still unsure. Elder Apiran gave her a small smile. I am not sure if he can enter the illusion battlefield right at this moment, but I am sure he will enter it sooner or later. However, if you want to meet him, you have to rely on your own strength for an opportunity to come. Hearing this, Margaret was confident. Okay, Master, I understand. I will put my best foot forward in the illusion battlefield. Seeing Margaret's confidence, Elder Apiran nodded in satisfaction. I believe you can obtain a good outcome. You are my most outstanding disciple yet. You also have the most powerful purple power body. I hope you can succeed this time. Now, let's go. It's time for me to get you out of the purple power world. In the last 5 years, Zen had used the roaring token many times in the universe. So how could Elder Apiran, who often left the purple power world, not know of Zen's movements? In fact, she was even aware that Zen had been besieged by the world lords of several races in the northern sky region. However, to make sure that Margaret focused on her cultivation, Elder Apiran did not want to convey this piece of information to Margaret. If Margaret was strong enough, she would meet Zen in the illusion battlefield easily. Margaret strode forward, now prepared to leave the purple power world with her master. She looked at the world covered in purple halos, her heart full of strong emotions. She knew that her journey was about to begin, and that she was about to search for Zen.